Imagine two of Greece's most powerful cities facing each other: Athens, rich, democratic, and mistress of the seas, and Sparta, austere, military, and feared on land. Mistrust, greed for power, and fear gave rise to a war that lasted almost 3 decades and changed the Greek world forever: the Peloponnesian War. But who do you think was more to blame for this conflict? Athens because it was becoming more and more powerful? Or Sparta because it did not want to accept this power? Write your answer in the comments below. If you want to know how a political power struggle became one of the most destructive wars of antiquity, stay tuned. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any more historical stories. And with that, welcome to our journey to a time when Greece was destroyed not by external enemies, but by itself. Chapter 1. Prologue: Greece before the storm. Before the Peloponnesian War began, Greece was not a unified country as we might expect today. There was no common king, no central government, and no capital that ruled over all Greeks. Instead, the Greek world consisted of many individual city-states. These city-states were called polis. Each polis was basically its own small state with its own laws, its own rulers, its own traditions, and often its own interests. Among the most famous of these city-states were Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Argos, and many smaller cities on the Greek mainland, on the islands of the Aegean Sea, and on the coasts of Asia Minor. Although these cities had many things in common, they were by no means always in agreement. They spoke similar dialects, worshipped many of the same gods, participated in common festivals and competitions, and considered themselves Greeks in a way. But in everyday life, each polis thought of itself first. This political fragmentation has been one of the main reasons why conflicts have erupted again and again in Greece. One city wanted to gain more influence, another wanted to secure its trade routes, and a third wanted to prevent a neighbor from becoming too powerful. Alliances were formed, broken, and renegotiated. Friendship and enmity could change quickly if it benefited one's own city. Nevertheless, there was a moment when the Greeks had to act together. A few decades before the Peloponnesian War, the powerful Persian Empire had advanced into Greece. For many Greek cities, this was an existential threat. Persia was huge, rich, and militarily strong. Against such an opponent, it would be difficult for the individual city-states to survive alone. In this danger, several Greek polis joined forces. Athens and Sparta, which were later to become bitter enemies, were still fighting on the same side at that time. The Persian Wars became a decisive turning point. The Greeks were able to repel the Persian attacks, including in famous battles such as Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea. These victories boosted the self-confidence of the Greeks enormously. They had proven that together they could resist even an empire. But the joint victory did not bring lasting peace. On the contrary, after the end of the Persian threat, a new question arose. Who should be the leading power in Greece? For a long time, Sparta was considered the strongest military power in the countryside. The Spartan soldiers were feared, their discipline was legendary, and their society was entirely focused on war and order. Sparta wanted stability above all. Changes, experiments, and rapid political developments were viewed with suspicion there. The Spartans were not out to build a large maritime or trading empire. They wanted to secure their supremacy in the Peloponnese and prevent other powers from threatening their order. Athens, on the other hand, developed rapidly after the Persian Wars. The city had played a decisive role, especially in the naval battle of Salamis. Its fleet was strong, its citizens were proud, and its political order was unusual. In Athens, male citizens could participate directly in political decisions. This democracy was not comparable to a modern democracy, because women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded. Nevertheless, it was a special form of government for the time. Athens became not only politically more important, but also economically and culturally. The port of Piraeus made the city a center of trade. Goods, ideas, and people flocked to Athens. Artists, philosophers, craftsmen, and politicians shaped the life of the city. Temples were built, festivals celebrated, plays performed. Athens increasingly saw itself as the center of the Greek world. But with Athens' rise, the suspicion of other cities also grew. Athens did not only use its strong fleet for defense. After the Persian Wars, Athens founded the Attic League with many other cities. Officially, this alliance was to continue to protect the Greeks from Persia. Many cities paid money or provided ships so that Athens could organize joint protection. Over time, however, the character of this alliance changed. A voluntary union became more and more an instrument of power for Athens. Cities that wanted to leave were put under pressure or militarily forced to remain in the alliance. The contributions of the allies increasingly flowed to Athens. There they were used not only for warships, but also for large construction projects and the strengthening of Athenian power. For Athens, this was a sign of strength. For many other cities, it seemed like oppression. Sparta and its allies in particular watched this development with growing concern. If Athens became richer and richer, built more and more ships and made more and more cities dependent on itself, how long would it be before Sparta was also threatened? This slowly created a dangerous tension. On the one side was Athens with its maritime alliance, its navy, its trade and its self-confidence. On the other side was Sparta with the Peloponnesian League, its land army, its tradition and its claim to preserve the old order. Both powers were completely different. Athens looked at the sea, Sparta at the land. Athens thrived on trade, movement, and political debate. Sparta relied on discipline, obedience, and military strength. These contrasts alone might not have had to trigger a war, but they were accompanied by fear. And fear is often more dangerous in politics than open hatred. Sparta feared that Athens could become too powerful. Athens feared that Sparta wanted to stop its rise. Both sides saw a threat in the other's behavior. Every new decision, every alliance, every dispute between smaller towns was suddenly understood as part of a larger power struggle. In addition, many smaller polis were drawn into this conflict. Some sought protection in Athens, others in Sparta. Still others tried to maneuver between the two sides. But the stronger the two power blocks became, the more difficult neutrality became. Those who did not take a clear position risked being viewed with suspicion from both sides. So before the war, Greece was a world full of glamour, but also full of tensions. It was a time of great cultural achievements, political experiments, and economic prosperity. At the same time, it was a time when questions of power became increasingly urgent. The victory over Persia had united the Greeks, but it had also shown how powerful individual city-states could become. Joint defense turned into competition. Competition turned into mistrust. And mistrust was eventually to turn into war. When we look back at the Peloponnesian War today, we don't just see a series of battles. We see how an entire world slowly gets into a conflict that in the end no one can really control. It doesn't start with a single event, not with a single command, not with a single attack. It begins with a development that builds up over years. Athens wants to secure its power. Sparta wants to prevent Athens from becoming too powerful. The smaller cities are trying to protect their own interests. And while everyone believes they are acting sensibly, war is getting closer and closer. The temples of Athens still stand in bright splendor. Sparta's soldiers are still marching in perfect order. Envoys are still negotiating, making alliances, and talking about peace. But under the surface, something has long since changed. Greece, which once stood together against Persia, is now on the verge of tearing itself apart. The storm has not yet broken out, but the clouds are already gathering. Chapter 2, Athens, the Power of the Sea. If you want to understand why Athens became one of the most powerful cities in the Greek world in the 5th century BC, you have to look at the sea. Not to the city walls, not first to the temples, not even to the popular assembly, but to the water that connected Athens to the Aegean Sea, the islands, the coasts of Asia Minor, and the trade routes of the Mediterranean. Athens' power did not only arise from its citizens, its orators, or its famous buildings. It arose mainly from his fleet. Athens was not directly on the sea, but a few kilometers inland. But with the port of Piraeus, the city had one of the most important seaports in the Greek world. Merchant ships and warships sailed from there. Goods from distant regions arrived there: grain, wood, metal, ceramics, wine, oil, and luxury goods. The port was a place of noise, movement, and encounter. Traders, sailors, craftsmen, foreigners, slaves, and citizens crowded between warehouses, shipyards, and piers. Anyone who entered Piraeus immediately sensed that Athens was more than just one city among many. It was a crossroads of the Greek world. Athens' rise to maritime power began decisively during the Persian Wars. As the Persian threat grew, the Athenian politician Themistocles realized that Athens could not be saved by walls or foot soldiers alone. The Persians were too powerful, their armies too large. Athens needed a different strength. That strength should be the fleet. Themistocles lobbied for Athens to build a large number of warships. These ships were called triremes. A trireme was fast, narrow, and dangerous. She was moved by many oarsmen and wore a ram spur on the bow, with which she could damage or sink enemy ships. Maintaining such a fleet was expensive and time-consuming. They needed wood, shipyards, equipment, experienced commanders, and above all, many men who rowed. But this was precisely one of Athens' political peculiarities. Because not only rich citizens served as rowers. Poorer citizens could also play an important role in the fleet. Those who rowed defended the city. Those who defended the city gained political weight. In this way, Athens' naval power was combined with its democracy. The fleet also made important those citizens who could not afford heavy hoplite armor. The common man became part of Athens' military strength. The Battle of Salamis showed how decisive this fleet could be. The Greeks, especially the Athenians, opposed the Persians on the water. The narrow straits made it difficult for the huge Persian fleet to play out its superiority. The mobile Greek ships used their maneuverability and their knowledge of the area. The victory at Salamis became a turning point. For Athens, it was more than a military success. It was proof that the future of the city lay on the sea. After the victory over Persia, Athens was no longer willing to step back into the second row. The city had made sacrifices, its inhabitants had had to leave their homes at times, and its fleet had played a decisive role. Now Athens also wanted the reward for this performance. While Sparta concentrated more on the Peloponnese and its land power after the war, Athens remained active. The Persian threat had not yet completely disappeared, and many Greek cities on the coasts and islands sought shelter. This is how the Attic League of the Sea came into being. Officially, it was a defensive alliance against Persia. Many cities joined Athens because they needed a strong fleet, but could not or did not want to provide enough ships themselves. Some members delivered ships, others paid money. The common treasury of the Federation was initially kept on the island of Delos, a religiously important place that stood for neutrality and common Greek tradition. But over time, the balance shifted. Athens increasingly took the lead. What initially looked like an alliance among partners gradually became an Athenian sphere of influence. Many cities paid contributions, but Athens decided how these funds were used. The Athenian fleet became stronger and stronger, and anyone who wanted to escape Athens' leadership had to reckon with harsh consequences. Some allies who wanted to leave were punished militarily. Their walls were torn down, their ships confiscated, their political independence restricted. For Athens, this was logical. From the Athenian point of view, the alliance could not be allowed to disintegrate, because a weak maritime alliance would have opened up new opportunities for Persia and endangered Athens' security. Moreover, Athens was convinced that it bore the burden of defense and therefore had the right to decide. But from the point of view of many allies, protection became more and more control. Leadership became rule. The Sea League became an empire, even if Athens may not always have called it that. The wealth that flowed to Athens through this system profoundly changed the city. Athens became more magnificent. Massive buildings were built on the Acropolis, including the Parthenon, the temple of the goddess Athena. Artists and architects worked on projects that are still famous today. The city became a center of culture. Playwrights such as Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes shaped the stage. Philosophers and thinkers discussed politics, truth, justice, and the good life. In the streets of Athens, you could feel a spiritual energy that attracted many people. But this blossom had its price. Athens' splendor was based not only on its own work and trade, but also on the contributions of its allies. This was precisely where a dangerous contradiction lay. The Athenians were proud of their freedom and their democracy. They celebrated themselves as citizens who determined their own fate. But they denied many cities in the Attic League precisely this freedom. Athens was democratic internally, but increasingly imperial externally. This dual role made Athens powerful, but also unpopular. Admiration and fear were close together. Many Greeks marveled at Athens' buildings, its poets, its orators, and its fleet. At the same time, they wondered how long it would take for their own city to come under Athenian pressure. In particular, trading cities such as Corinth saw Athens as a dangerous rival. Every new Athenian decision could be understood as an attack on the interests of others. Sparta viewed this development with growing suspicion. The Spartans were not a naval power in the same sense. Their strength lay in their land army, in their discipline, and in their control of the Peloponnese. But Athens was able to strike with its fleet where Sparta was vulnerable, on coasts, on islands, on trade routes, and with allies. As long as Athens dominated the sea, it could import grain, transport troops, besiege cities, and put down uprisings. Sparta could not ignore such power. Within Athens, too, naval power changed the self-image of the citizens. The Athenians saw themselves as modern, flexible, and superior. They believed that their democracy, their navy, and their wealth were signs of a special destiny. There was passionate discussion in the people's assemblies. Speakers could gain great influence if they convinced the crowd. Decisions about war, peace, alliances, and punitive actions were negotiated before the citizens. This made Athens dynamic, but sometimes also unpredictable. Because a democracy can be courageous, but also overconfident. It can make smart decisions, but it can also be driven by emotions, pride, and fear. When a city gets used to success, it finds it difficult to accept limits. Athens had resisted Persia, created a naval alliance, accumulated wealth, and achieved cultural greatness. So why should it let Sparta or other cities dictate to it how far its power could reach? It was precisely this attitude that made Athens dangerous in the eyes of many opponents. It was not only strong, but also self-confident. Not only rich, but ambitious. Not just a city, but the center of a growing sphere of power. The Athenian walls that connected Athens to the port of Piraeus became a symbol of this strength. Even if enemies devastated the surrounding countryside, Athens could remain behind its walls and continue to be supplied via the port. The sea was his lifeline. But every lifeline can also become a dependency. Athens' power was based on ships, trade, money, and allies. If one of them began to falter, the entire construction could be endangered. The larger Athens' empire became, the more it had to control. The more it controlled, the more resistance it generated. And the more resistance arose, the harder Athens had to be in order to maintain its power. Thus, Athens was at the height of its power before the start of the Peloponnesian War. The city was shining, its fleet dominated the Aegean, its coffers were full, its citizens were proud. But beneath this splendor lay tensions. Many allies felt oppressed. Rivals felt threatened. Sparta saw Greece's balance in danger. Athens had become the power of the sea. But the sea, which brought wealth, protection, and glory, also carried the conflict further. Athens' influence spread from port to port, from island to island, from alliance to alliance. And with each step, the question grew that would soon shake all of Greece. Would Athens be able to limit its power, or would its strength ultimately trigger the very war it thought it would avoid? Chapter 3: Sparta, the power of the land. If Athens was the power of the sea, then Sparta was the power of the land. While Athens relied on trade, navies, ports, orators, and political debates, Sparta's strength was based on discipline, order, and military toughness. Sparta was unlike almost any other Greek city. It was not famous for magnificent temples, not for great theatrical poets, not for lively assemblies of the people, and not for an open harbor full of merchants from all over the world. Sparta was famous for its soldiers. But Sparta was not just a city with a strong army. Sparta was a society that was almost entirely focused on war, control, and obedience. The entire life of a Spartan citizen was designed to make the state strong. Personal wishes, luxury, comfort, or public self-presentation played a much smaller role than in Athens. In Sparta, it was not who spoke the most beautifully, who had the greatest wealth, or who could convince the crowd best. What counted was who was willing to fit in, obey, and in an emergency, die for Sparta. The basis of this order lay in the special situation of Sparta. Sparta ruled large parts of Laconia and especially Messenia, a fertile area in the Peloponnese. There lived the Helots, a subjugated population who had to work for the Spartans. They tilled the fields, delivered taxes, and made it possible for the Spartan full citizens to devote themselves almost entirely to war training. Without the work of the Helots, Sparta would hardly have been able to maintain its military society. But it was precisely this order that was Sparta's greatest weakness. The Helots were clearly numerically superior to the Spartan full citizens. The Spartans therefore constantly lived with the fear of an uprising. Their military discipline was not only directed against external enemies, but also internally. Sparta had to stay strong because they couldn't afford to be weak. A lost war, a heavy defeat, or a long absence of soldiers could become dangerous if the subjugated population saw the opportunity to revolt. That's why Sparta was cautious. It is often described only as warlike, but this description is incomplete. Sparta was militarily strong, but not reckless. The Spartans did not wage every war for the pleasure of conquest. Above all, they wanted to maintain their order. Change was dangerous for her. Too much trade, too much wealth, too much contact with foreign ideas. All of this, from a Spartan point of view, could weaken discipline and corrode society. Even the education of the Spartan boys showed how seriously this attitude was meant. From a young age, they were accepted into a state-organized training system. There they were to learn toughness, endurance, obedience, and fighting spirit. Hunger, cold, pain, and deprivation were part of this upbringing. A Spartan boy should not learn to live a comfortable life. He should learn to control himself and function in a group. In the end, he was not to become a single hero, but a reliable part of the Spartan fighting community. This fighting community showed its strength especially in the hoplite phalanx. The Spartan soldiers fought heavily armed, close together, shield to shield. In such a formation, courage was important, but trust was even more important. Every man had to hold his position. Those who fled endangered not only themselves, but also the man next to them. The phalanx was a symbol of Sparta's society. The individual subordinated himself to the whole. This is exactly what made the Spartan army so feared. Other Greek cities also had hoplites, but the Spartans were considered particularly disciplined and professional. While many citizens of other cities only took up arms from time to time, the Spartan full citizen was prepared for war all his life. His everyday life, his upbringing, his values, and his honor were linked to being a soldier. Sparta was also politically organized differently than Athens. There was no democracy based on the Athenian model. Sparta had two kings, who mainly fulfilled military and religious tasks. In addition, there was the Council of Elders and the Ephors, powerful officials who had great influence on politics. Although the Spartan citizens could vote on certain issues in an assembly, the political order was much more conservative and controlled than in Athens. Oratory skills and open debate played a much smaller role. Decisions should not arise from heated speeches, but from tradition, experience, and state order. In the eyes of many Greeks, Sparta therefore seemed both admirable and foreign. They admired the discipline, the bravery, and the simplicity of the Spartans. At the same time, many felt their way of life was hard, closed, and backward. Sparta was not a place that easily attracted foreigners. It was not a center of trade and not a melting pot of ideas. It was a power that wanted to remain strong precisely through isolation. However, this isolation did not mean that Sparta had no influence. On the contrary, Sparta led the Peloponnesian League, an alliance system of many cities in the Peloponnese and beyond. This alliance was structured differently from the Attic League of Athens. Sparta did not demand regular payments from its allies in the same way for a joint fleet. Instead, his power was based primarily on military leadership and political influence. Many cities joined Sparta because they sought protection, because they distrusted Athens, or because their own political order was more suited to Sparta. Particularly oligarchic cities, i.e. cities in which a few powerful men ruled, often saw Sparta as a natural ally. Athens more often supported democratic movements, Sparta more aristocratic or oligarchic forces. As a result, the conflict between Athens and Sparta became not only a struggle between two states, but also a struggle of different political models. On the one side was Athens' democracy with its imperial maritime alliance. On the other side was Sparta's conservative order with its network of allies. But Sparta had a problem. It was strong on land, but weak at sea. As long as a war was decided on the mainland, Sparta could play to its greatest strength. His hoplites were feared. His army could march into Attica, devastate fields, and threaten Athenian allies. But Athens was able to retreat behind its walls and continue to supply via the port of Piraeus. Athens' fleet gave the city a mobility that Sparta could not compensate for a long time. This made the conflict particularly complicated. Sparta could not simply destroy Athens in a land battle if Athens refused such a battle. Athens, on the other hand, could not easily defeat Sparta in the heart of the Peloponnese as long as Sparta's land army remained unbroken. Both powers were superior in different areas. This is precisely why the coming war became so long, so grueling, and so difficult to decide. Before the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, there was growing concern in Sparta that Athens could destroy the balance of Greece. For the Spartans, Athens' development was unsettling. The fleet became stronger, the maritime league stronger, the coffers fuller, the political influence greater. Athens got involved in conflicts, supported allies, and became increasingly self-confident. What Athens saw as a legitimate safeguard of its power, Sparta saw as a threat. It was not just about honor or rivalry. It was about safety. If Athens brought more and more cities under its influence, Sparta could eventually be isolated. If Athens' money and ships continued to grow, it could perhaps cause unrest in the Peloponnese as well. When democratic ideas spread, they could destabilize Sparta's oligarchic allies. And if Sparta waited too long, Athens could eventually be so powerful that it could be unstoppable. So Sparta was faced with a difficult decision. Should it continue to wait, hoping that Athens' power would reach its limits on its own? Or should it act before it was too late? For a society that valued stability above all else, this question was threatening. War could endanger one's own order, but so could doing nothing. So Sparta was not simply Athens' aggressive opponent. It was a power that came under increasing pressure out of fear of change, concern for its allies, and distrust of Athens' rise. His strength lay in discipline, but his weakness lay in rigidity. It could win land wars, but it struggled with a world in which maritime trade, money, fleets, and political mobility were becoming increasingly important. While Athens seemed to be pushing into the future, Sparta held on to the past. But it was precisely this past that gave him strength. The Spartan soldiers stood for order in a troubled world. For many allies, Sparta was the bulwark against Athenian superiority. For Athens, however, Sparta was an obstacle, an old guardian who did not want to accept the rise of the new naval power. Thus, two very different powers faced each other. Athens, open, ambitious, rich and carried by the sea. Sparta, closed, disciplined, cautious and shaped by the land. Both believed they were acting for their safety. Both believed that they could not give in. And both were convinced that the other side was the real danger. War was not yet inevitable. But with every crisis, every alliance dispute and every mutual warning, the gap between Athens and Sparta became smaller. Two systems, two ways of life and two ideas of power slowly moved towards each other. And when a power of the sea and a power of the land distrust each other, then at some point a single spark is enough to set the whole of Greece on fire. Chapter 4. The Cold War of the Greeks. Before the Peloponnesian War broke out openly, Greece was already in a state of tense enmity. It was not yet a full-scale war in which Athens and Sparta fought against each other by all means. But it was no longer real peace either. An atmosphere of mistrust, threats, alliance politics and mutual observation arose between the two power blocks. Every decision of one side was carefully examined by the other side. Every movement of a ship, every new wall, every alliance and every dispute between smaller towns could suddenly take on great importance. This period could be described as a kind of Cold War between the Greeks. Athens and Sparta faced each other without immediately starting the great open conflict. Both knew that war would be dangerous. Both knew the strength of the other. Sparta knew that Athens could hardly be beaten on the sea with its fleet. Athens knew that Sparta remained a formidable power on land. A direct collision could therefore be expensive for both sides. Therefore, they initially tried to exert pressure, win allies, intimidate opponents, and strengthen their own position. To the outside world, there were still treaties and diplomatic talks. Envoys traveled back and forth between cities. Alliances were confirmed, complaints were made, and demands were made. But beneath the surface, the tension grew. The real conflict was not only the question of whether Athens or Sparta was stronger. It was about what order should apply in Greece. Should a dynamic maritime power like Athens dominate the Aegean Sea and tie more and more cities to itself? Or should Sparta, as a traditional land power, maintain its balance and prevent a single polis from becoming too powerful? For many smaller city-states, this situation was particularly difficult. They had to ask themselves which side they should take. Those who joined Athens may have received protection from the fleet, access to trade, and a place in the powerful Sea League. But this protection could quickly become an addiction. Those who joined Sparta could hope for the support of Greece's strongest land army. But Sparta also expected loyalty and wanted to keep its allies politically in line. Staying neutral became more and more difficult. In such a world, even a local dispute could be dangerous. When two smaller cities came into conflict with each other, the decisive question was often no longer just who was in the right. It became much more important which major power block was behind which city. A dispute over a colony, a port, trade rights, or political influence could suddenly become a crisis between Athens and Sparta. This created a network of dependencies in which almost every regional dispute could bring the great conflict closer. Athens acted with increasing self-confidence during this period. The city considered its leading role in the Attic Sea League to be necessary. From the Athenian point of view, one's own power was not a problem, but a prerequisite for security. The Persians were not yet completely forgotten. The Aegean Sea had to be protected, trade routes had to be secured, and the allies had to be controlled. If individual cities wanted to withdraw from the Maritime League, Athens saw this not simply as a right to self-determination, but as a danger to the entire alliance system. But it was precisely this attitude that seemed threatening to many other Greeks. Athens spoke of security, but often acted like a ruling power. Contributions were collected, fleets were deployed, and disobedient allies were punished. The line between alliance leadership and imperial control became increasingly blurred. The stronger Athens became, the more the fear grew that no one could stop it. Sparta saw this development with great concern. The Spartans were not known for acting quickly and rashly. Their political system was cautious, conservative, and intent on stability. But that was precisely why Athens' rapid rise frightened them. From a Spartan point of view, Athens changed the balance of the Greek world. A city that collected more and more money, ships and allies could sooner or later threaten Sparta's influence. Even if Athens did not yet attack directly, the possibility of a future threat was enough to make Sparta nervous. This created a dangerous cycle between the two powers. Athens expanded its power because it wanted to feel safer. Sparta felt threatened by this expansion and strengthened its position. This reaction, in turn, confirmed Athens' distrust of Sparta. Each side interpreted the behavior of the other as evidence of hostile intentions. What one side called defense, the other saw as a provocation. A particularly important point was the handling of walls and harbors. For Athens, the long walls, which connected the city to the port of Piraeus, were a symbol of security. Even if an enemy army devastated the surrounding area, Athens could remain behind its walls and be supplied by sea. For Sparta, however, these walls were a sign that Athens was preparing for a long conflict. They made the city difficult to attack and strengthened its independence from the land power of Sparta. The economic situation also worsened. Athens controlled important sea routes and had enormous trade advantages through its port. Cities that lived from trade saw in it not only prosperity, but also competition. Corinth, a powerful trading city and ally of Sparta, felt challenged by Athens. Corinth had its own interests in western Greece, on the seas and in its colonies. If Athens gained influence there, it was perceived not only as a political but also as an economic threat. Thus, the pressure on Sparta grew not only from its own fear, but also from its allies. Many Spartan allies expected Sparta to finally take a more decisive stance against Athens. For them, Sparta's restraint was difficult to understand. From their point of view, Athens continued to expand, while Sparta hesitated too long. These allies played an important role, as they pushed Sparta into a tougher stance. An alliance leader cannot permanently ignore his allies without losing reputation. Athens, in turn, watched closely how the mood in the Peloponnesian camp changed. The Athenians knew that Sparta might be cautious on its own, but that a Sparta could become more dangerous under pressure from its allies. In the Athenian Popular Assembly, such questions were passionately discussed. Should one give in to keep the peace? Or would giving in only show weakness and encourage opponents to make further demands? In a city that was proud of its power, the thought of retreat was hard to accept. This made the political mood on both sides tougher. In Athens, speakers could win approval when they called for strength and determination. In Sparta, those voices that warned that Athens' power would soon become uncontrollable could gain more weight. Reasonable compromises became more difficult because any concession appeared to be a threat to one's own reputation. Those who gave and risked being seen as weak in their own camp. The Cold War of the Greeks was therefore not only a conflict of armies. It was a conflict of perceptions. Both sides felt threatened. Both sides believed that they were only reacting to provocations. Both sides were convinced that the other side was destroying the balance. Such situations are particularly dangerous because the war does not necessarily arise from a grand plan, but from a series of decisions, each of which seems logical individually. A city calls for help. An alliance partner is calling for support. A trading ban is imposed. A fleet is sent. An appeal is dismissed. Every single action can be justified, but together they form a chain that can hardly be stopped. In this period before the Great War, it became clear how fragile the Greek world was. The joint victories against Persia had once given hope for unity. But this unit had never been strong enough to permanently overcome the rivalries of the polis. As soon as the external enemy receded into the background, the old antagonisms returned. Only now the means of power were greater than before. Athens had a huge fleet and a rich alliance system. Sparta led a strong land power and was urged to act by disgruntled allies. So Greece lived in a tense interim period. There was still peace, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. Treaties were still mentioned, but they were trusted less and less. People still spoke of law and loyalty to the alliance, But these words have long been about power and fear. The open war did not suddenly start out of nowhere. He grew out of this atmosphere. Suspicion turned into hostility. Hostility turned into block formation. Block formation turned into pressure. And at some point, pressure turned into the decision that a war might be inevitable. Athens and Sparta faced each other like two heavy thunderstorms. For a long time, they moved slowly towards each other. The distant thunder was already heard, but the lightning had not yet struck. Everyone may have hoped that the storm would pass. But at the same time, everyone was preparing for it to come. Chapter 5. The Spark. Why the War Began. Great wars rarely start for a single reason. Often there is not one moment when everything is suddenly decided. Instead, tensions build up over years. Mistrust grows, old disputes are reassessed, smaller conflicts become more important, and at some point a war that could have been avoided for a long time suddenly seems inevitable. This was also the case with the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta have long been suspicious of each other. Both cities were powerful, both had allies, both believed they had to defend their own security. Athens saw itself as the protecting power of the Aegean Sea and the leader of a large maritime alliance. Sparta saw itself as the guardian of the balance in Greece and as the protecting power of many cities that feared Athens' power. Each side increasingly saw the other not as a rival but as a threat. But a general mistrust alone is not enough to trigger a war. Concrete crises are needed. And it was precisely these crises that arose more and more frequently in the years before the war. Three conflicts played a particularly important role: the dispute over Kerkyra, the conflict over Potidaea, and the so-called Megarian Sophisma, i.e. an Athenian resolution against the city of Megara. Each of these conflicts was limited in its own right. Taken together, however, they looked like sparks in a room full of dry wood. The first major point of contention was Kerkyra, an island in western Greece. Kerkyra, now Corfu, was an important maritime power and had a strong fleet. It was originally a colony of Corinth, but there had been enmity between Kerkyra and Corinth for a long time. When a conflict arose over the city of Epidamnos, Kerkyra and Corinth came into conflict more and more. Corinth was an important ally for Sparta. For Athens, the situation was delicate, but also tempting. Kerkyra asked Athens for support. The Athenians now had to decide whether to interfere. On the one hand, supporting Kerkyra meant a provocation against Corinth and thus indirectly against Sparta. On the other hand, Kerkyra had a large fleet. If this fleet had fallen into the hands of Corinth, and thus into the camp of the Spartans, the balance of power at sea would have shifted dangerously. For Athens, this was hardly acceptable. So Athens decided to support Kerkyra, albeit cautiously. They did not conclude a complete offensive alliance, but a defensive alliance. Athens wanted to prevent Kerkyra from being defeated without officially starting a major war. But such subtle diplomatic differences count for little when warships meet. In the naval battle of the Sabota Islands, Athenian ships intervened and prevented a clear Corinthian victory. This was a heavy blow for Corinth. From his point of view, Athens had intervened in a conflict that directly affected Corinth. Athens claimed to have acted defensively. Corinth saw this as an aggressive interference. Once again, the basic problem of this time became apparent. The same action could be a defense from the point of view of one side and a provocation from the point of view of the other side. The second conflict was sparked by Potidaea. This city was located in Chalkidiki and was in a particularly complicated situation. Potidaea was a member of the Attic League and thus had to obey Athens. At the same time, the city was originally a colony of Corinth and continued to maintain close relations with Corinth. Thus, Potidaea stood between two worlds, politically dependent on Athens, emotionally and historically connected to Corinth. After the crisis around Kerkyra, Athens distrusted Corinth even more. The Athenians feared that Potidaea might rise up against Athens with Corinthian help. Therefore, they made tough demands. Among other things, Potidaea was to partially demolish its walls, provide hostages, and sever ties with Corinthian officials. For Athens, this was a security measure. For Potidaea and Corinth, it was a sign of Athenian oppression. Potidaea finally decided to revolt against Athens. Corinth supported the city with volunteers. Athens reacted militarily and began a siege. Thus, another local conflict had become part of the great power struggle. For Athens, it was a matter of maintaining authority over its maritime alliance. If Potidaea was able to successfully leave, other cities could follow. For Corinth, it was a matter of curbing Athens' influence and defending its own honor. The third and perhaps symbolically most important point of contention was Megara. Megara was strategically important between Attica and the Peloponnese. The city was allied with Sparta and had already had a checkered relationship with Athens before. Athens issued a decree against Megara denying Megarians access to the ports and markets of the Athenian sphere of influence. This decision hit Megara hard economically. The exact reasons for this Athenian step were already discussed in ancient times. Athens accused Megara, among other things, of border violations and other offenses. But for Megara and his allies, the decision was an economic weapon. When Athens used its power to exclude a Spartan ally from trade, it was more than a local punitive measure. It was a sign of how dangerous Athens' control over markets and ports had become. Corinth and Megara now urged Sparta to act more and more. They accused Athens of breaking the peace and expanding its power at the expense of other cities. Sparta itself was cautious, but the pressure from its allies grew. If Sparta did not respond, it risked appearing as a weak ally. And weakness was dangerous in the Greek world of states. Sparta finally convened consultations. The allies were able to raise their grievances against Athens. Corinth, in particular, was sharp, accusing the Spartans of hesitating too long. From the Corinthian point of view, Athens was an active, ambitious, and dangerous power, while Sparta reacted too slowly and too passively. These accusations hit a sensitive point. Sparta saw itself as a leading power. If its own allies had the impression that Sparta could not protect them, the entire alliance system was called into question. In Sparta, the decisive question was now asked: had Athens broken the peace? And more importantly, had Athens' power grown to the point where war became necessary? The Athenian historian Thucydides, who himself wrote about the war, saw the deeper cause above all as the rise of Athens and the fear that this rise caused in Sparta. So the individual points of contention were not meaningless, but they were not the whole explanation. They were the triggers. The real fuel was the fear of Athens' power. Sparta finally decided that Athens had broken the peace. This was not yet the end of the road to war, but the direction was clear. Further demands on Athens followed. The Spartans demanded, among other things, that Athens should revoke the decision against Megara. This was difficult for Athens. If the city had given in, it might have kept peace. But many Athenians saw it as a humiliation. If Athens withdrew its own decision under Spartan pressure, what would be demanded next? Here Pericles came to the fore decisively. He was one of the most influential men in Athens and warned against giving in to Sparta. Not because he absolutely wanted war, but because he believed that giving in would only encourage the enemy. For Pericles, it was a matter of principle. If Sparta could dictate to Athens how to deal with Megara, then Athens' independence was threatened. Today it would be about Megara, tomorrow perhaps about the Sea League, the fleet, or the walls. This attitude shows how much honor, prestige, and credibility counted in Greek politics. It was not just about immediate interests. It was about how a city was perceived. A great power was not allowed to appear weak. An alliance leader could not hesitate. A political decision could not simply be revoked under external pressure. So the room for compromise became smaller and smaller. Both sides believed that they were acting sensibly. Sparta believed it had to stop Athens' expansion before it was too late. Athens believed that it had to defend its independence and its alliance system. Corinth believed that it had to protect its interests against Athenian interference. Megara saw itself economically threatened. Potidaea wanted to escape Athens' control. Kerkyra sought protection from Corinth. Each individual city had its own reasons, but all of them together led them into the same abyss. So the Peloponnesian War did not begin because a single ruler ordered an attack on a whim. It began because a whole system of rivalries, alliances, and fears got out of control. Small conflicts became touchstones of credibility. Local disputes became questions of power and honor. Diplomatic demands became ultimatums. And at some point, war was no longer just a possibility, but seemed to many to be an inevitable consequence. The tragic thing is that almost all those involved believed that they were waging the war for security reasons. No one said openly, "We want to destroy Greece." No one planned to plunge an entire generation into a decades-long conflict. But that is exactly what happened. Caution turned into harshness. Harshness turned into intransigence. Intransigence turned into war. When the last negotiations failed, the storm could no longer be stopped. The alliances were ready, the armies were prepared, the fleets were in the ports. The Greek world, which had once fought together against Persia, now finally divided into two camps. The spark had fallen. And this time, not only a single city would burn. All of Greece was supposed to be in flames. Chapter 6: Pericles and his strategy. When the Peloponnesian War began, Athens was faced with a difficult truth: it could hardly defeat Sparta in the countryside. The Spartan army was considered the strongest in all of Greece. Their hoplites were famous for discipline, toughness, and combat experience. If Athens had engaged in an open battle against Sparta, the risk of a crushing defeat would have been great. This is precisely why Athens needed a different kind of war. And this strategy was inextricably linked to one man: Pericles. Pericles was the most influential political figure in Athens at the time. He was not a king and not an autocrat. Athens was a democracy, and decisions were made in the people's assembly. But Pericles had enormous influence. He was able to talk, convince, and win political majorities. Many Athenians trusted him because his policies had made Athens rich, powerful, and famous. Under his leadership, the city had become a cultural center. The Acropolis was expanded, great buildings were built, and Athens saw itself as the pinnacle of Greek civilization. But now it was no longer about splendor, temples, and festivals. Now it was a matter of survival. Pericles knew that Sparta would try to force Athens into a land battle. The Spartans were able to march with their army into Attica, i.e., into the area around Athens. They could devastate fields, destroy villages, cut down olive trees, and destroy crops. For many Athenians, this was a terrible idea. The land was not only property, but home. There were courtyards, sanctuaries, graves, and memories. When an enemy devastated one's own country, it was perceived not only as economic damage, but also as personal humiliation. Nevertheless, Pericles demanded exactly what must have seemed unbearable to many: the Athenians should not face battle. They were to abandon the land, retreat behind the walls, and endure Sparta's devastation. This decision was tough, but logical from a military point of view. Athens had a decisive advantage that Sparta did not have: the long walls. These walls connected the city of Athens with the port of Piraeus. As long as Athens maintained this connection and its fleet remained strong, the city could be supplied by sea. Even when Spartan soldiers stood in front of the walls, grain, goods, and supplies could arrive via the harbor. Athens was not as easily starved as other cities. So Pericles relied on patience. He didn't want a quick, heroic, decisive fight. He wanted to wage a long war in which Athens played to its strengths and Sparta felt its weaknesses. Sparta was superior on land, but it did not have a strong fleet at first. Athens was superior at sea and could attack the coasts of the Peloponnese with its ships, disrupt trade, support allies, and put pressure on Sparta's alliance system. The strategy was simple in its basic idea, but difficult in its implementation. Athens was to remain defensively on land and act offensively at sea. The citizens were supposed to protect themselves behind the walls, while the fleet carried the war to the outside world. But such a strategy required enormous self-control. Many Athenians did not want to stand idly by while their fields burned. Especially those who owned land in Attica suffered from Pericles' plan. They had to leave their homes and move to the city. Whole families flocked to Athens with what they could carry or load onto wagons. Farmers, children, the elderly, animals, and household goods crowded the streets and open spaces of the city. For a polis that was already densely populated, this meant a huge burden. Athens became fuller, louder, and more tense. People who were used to living in the countryside now had to endure between walls. Many found only simple accommodation. Some lived in makeshift huts, others in temple precincts or public areas. The protection of the walls was at the same time a feeling of narrowness. The city became a fortress, but also a cage. Pericles had to explain to these people why they should not fight. That was perhaps the most difficult task of his political career. In a Greek world where bravery on the battlefield was highly valued, restraint could easily seem like cowardice. But Pericles tried to make it clear to the Athenians that courage does not always mean attacking immediately. Sometimes courage means enduring anger, not falling into a trap, and denying the enemy the battle he desires. Sparta had a problem. His army could devastate Attica, but it could not simply take Athens. The walls were too strong, and without control over the sea, Athens remained supplyable. A Spartan invasion was painful for the Athenians, but not decisive. If Athens kept calm, Sparta could not force a quick victory. Pericles believed that time was on Athens' side. The city had cash reserves, tributes from the seabund, and a strong fleet. As long as Athens did not risk a heavy defeat and controlled its allies, it could hold out the war longer than Sparta. Sparta had to keep its allies together and at the same time make sure that its own order was not endangered by long campaigns. A short war suited Sparta's strengths. A long, grueling war could pose problems for Sparta. But Pericles' plan also had weaknesses. It was based on the fact that the Athenians remained disciplined. It was based on the fact that the fleet functioned reliably. It was based on the fact that the city received enough supplies. And above all, it was based on the fact that life within the walls remained controllable. It was precisely at this point that it would soon become clear how vulnerable Athens was despite its walls. Because the concentration of so many people in the city created dangerous conditions. Overcrowding, poor hygiene, and cramped conditions could promote diseases. No one could have guessed that this very consequence of the strategy would lead to disaster. Pericles had reckoned with Sparta's army, with long sieges, with political pressure, and with economic burdens. But no fleet, no wall, and no speech could help against a plague. At the beginning of the war, however, his strategy seemed reasonable. When the Spartans invaded Attica, the Athenians stayed behind the walls. They saw smoke on the horizon, heard reports of destroyed fields, and had to swallow the anger. At the same time, Athenian ships set sail and attacked coastal areas of the Peloponnese. The war took exactly the form that Pericles had foreseen. Sparta devastated land, Athens dominated the sea. For many Athenians, this was unsatisfactory. They wanted to drive out the enemy, not just survive. But Pericles reminded them that Athens' true strength lay not in the fields of Attica, but in the navy, in the money, in the port, and in the alliance system. As long as these foundations were preserved, Athens was not defeated. A burnt field was bad. A lost fleet would be deadly. This way of thinking shows how modern Pericles' strategy was in some ways. He thought not only in terms of battles, but in terms of resources, supplies, alliances, and endurance. He understood that a war between such different powers would not necessarily be decided by a single heroic struggle. It was a matter of imposing one's own conditions on the opponent and not letting oneself be drawn into his strength. But political strategies never exist only on maps or in speeches. They meet people. Farmers who are losing their land. To families living in crowded streets. to citizens who are becoming impatient, to opponents who portray any restraint as weakness. Pericles not only had to resist Sparta, but also the mood in his own city. His opponents accused him of letting Athens suffer passively. Some wanted to take a more offensive approach, others perhaps sought a faster peace. But Pericles stuck to his course. He believed that Athens could only lose if it forgot its own strength and met Sparta on its preferred field. It was not the Spartan army that was to determine how this war was fought, but Athens itself. In this attitude lay Pericles' greatness, but also his tragedy. He recognized many things correctly. Athens' fleet was decisive, the walls were a protection, an open land battle would have been dangerous, and patience could weaken Sparta. But he underestimated how difficult it was for a democratic city to endure years of suffering without any visible victory. He may also have underestimated how quickly fear and frustration could change political decisions. Pericles' strategy was therefore not a plan for fame, but a plan for perseverance. It demanded that Athens be strong without immediately retaliating. It demanded that property be sacrificed in order to save the city. She demanded confidence in a long-term bill while the short-term pain was visible and burning. At the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, Athens was therefore not only faced with Sparta, but also with an internal test. Could a proud, passionate, and democratic city remain quiet while the enemy ravaged its land? Could she trust in her fleet instead of unleashing her anger in a dangerous land battle? Could she tell the difference between courage and impatience? Pericles believed in it. He believed that if Athens remained true to itself, it could survive the war and perhaps win in the end. But while the walls protected the people and the fleet dominated the sea, an invisible danger was already gathering in the crowded city. Sparta stood outside the walls. But the next great enemy of Athens would come from within. Chapter 7: The Plague of Athens. While the Spartans were devastating Attica outside the walls, many Athenians still believed that their city was safe. The walls were standing, the port of Piraeus was open, the fleet dominated the sea, and Pericles' strategy seemed to be working, at least militarily. Sparta could destroy the fields, but not conquer the city itself. Athens was enclosed, but not cut off. It suffered, but it lived. But then came an enemy against whom no wall helped. In the second year of the war, a devastating epidemic broke out in Athens. It hit a city that was already overcrowded by the war. Thousands of people from the surrounding area had sought refuge behind the walls. Peasant families, the elderly, children, the dispossessed, animals, and household goods crowded into a city that was not prepared for such a crowd. Many lived in simple huts, in cramped rooms, in temple precincts, or in open spaces. The air was heavy, the streets were full of people, supplies were strained, and hygienic conditions were getting worse and worse. In this environment, illness could spread rapidly. What exactly this epidemic was is still disputed today. Some suspect typhoid fever, others smallpox, measles, Ebola-like diseases, or another infectious disease. For the people at that time, the exact medical cause was unimportant. They only saw that the disease came suddenly, was cruel, and almost no one was safe from it. The historian Thucydides, who himself fell ill and survived, described the plague with shocking accuracy. The sick suffered from fever, inflammation, shortness of breath, thirst, pain, and weakness. Many died after a few days. Others survived, but remained scarred. Some lost fingers, toes, or their eyesight. The disease seemed so strange and destructive that even experienced doctors were helpless. Those who tried to treat the sick often infected themselves. Athens was prepared for a siege, but not for such a catastrophe. Pericles' plan had been to protect the population behind the walls. But it was precisely this concentration of people that now became its undoing. The walls that offered protection from Sparta did not stop the disease. On the contrary, they turned Athens into a narrow space in which the epidemic could spread unhindered. The psychological effect was at least as bad as the physical one. At first, many people may have hoped that the disease would pass. But as more and more died, fear turned into despair. Families were torn apart. Houses were filled with sick people. Streets and public squares became places of suffering. The normal rules of coexistence began to disintegrate. What was particularly bad was that the epidemic destroyed any form of security. In war, you could see the enemy. They knew where the Spartan army stood, which fields were burning and which walls offered protection. But the disease was invisible. It could affect anyone, rich or poor, young or old, citizen or stranger, soldier or politician. No bravery, no wealth, and no political position offered protection. Religion also fell into crisis. In the ancient world, people often sought explanations from the gods in disasters. Perhaps a sanctuary had been insulted. Perhaps an oath had been broken. Perhaps the gods punished the city. But while the prayers were being said, the people continued to die. Temples and holy places, which were supposed to offer protection and comfort, were filled with refugees and the sick. Some lost faith in divine order. Others clung even more desperately to signs, oracles, and sacrifices. Over time, the social order also broke up. If people believed that they could die soon anyway, laws and norms lost their force. Some no longer cared about possessions, decency, or duties. Others tried to quickly enjoy what they had left. Wealth suddenly changed hands because entire families died. Funeral rites could no longer be carried out properly because there were too many dead. In a society in which honor, family, and religious rituals were of great importance, this was a deep shock. The plague thus attacked the heart of Athens. Not only bodies died, but also trust. Trust in leadership, trust in the gods, trust in the community, and trust in one's own future. Athens was a city that was proud of its democracy, its culture, and its strength. Now it became clear how fragile all this could become when fear and death determined everyday life. The plague was also devastating militarily. Many citizens, soldiers, and rowers died. The fleet and the army lost people who could not be easily replaced. Athens was still strong, but weakened. The war, which would have been difficult enough even without the plague, now became an even greater burden. While Sparta exerted pressure from without, the disease ate Athens from within. In this crisis, Pericles also came under heavy pressure. Many Athenians blamed him for their suffering. Hadn't he demanded that the rural population move to the city? Hadn't his strategy caused the overcrowding? Couldn't one have acted differently? Such questions became louder the greater the desperation became. People who had lost their land and now lost relatives to the epidemic were looking for culprits. Pericles tried to hold the city together. He reminded the Athenians of their strength, of their power, of their responsibility, and of the need not to panic. But words had a hard time against corpses, hunger, fear, and disease. Even an orator like Pericles could not speak away reality. The population was exhausted, angry, and traumatized. Finally, the plague also affected Pericles personally. First he lost relatives and friends. Then he fell ill himself. The man who had led Athens through the beginning of the war died of the catastrophe that had inadvertently exacerbated his strategy. His death was more than the loss of a politician. It meant the end of an era. With Pericles, Athens lost a leader who, despite all the criticism, had pursued a clear line. He had understood that Athens had to be careful, that it could protect its fleet and not let emotions drive it into a land battle. After his death, democracy remained alive, but the political leadership became more restless. New men came forward, some ambitious, some radical, some ready to take advantage of the mood of the crowd. Without Pericles, Athens became more impulsive. The plague thus changed not only the course of the war, but also the character of the city. Athens lost people, resources, and self-confidence. The belief in their own invincibility was shaken. The citizens had experienced that their walls could keep Sparta away, but not the suffering. They had seen that power and wealth were no guarantee of security. And yet Athens did not give up. This is one of the most remarkable pages of this story. Despite the epidemic, despite the deaths, despite the political shock, the city continued to fight. The fleet remained active. The People's Assembly continued to meet. Alliances were kept, campaigns were planned, and decisions were made. Athens was wounded, but not defeated. This is precisely where the tragedy lies. The plague could have been a moment when Athens and Sparta realized how destructive this war was. But instead, the conflict continued. The dead were mourned, but the power struggles did not end. The war had developed a momentum of its own that was not stopped even by a catastrophe of such proportions. The Plague of Athens was one of the darkest moments of the Peloponnesian War. It showed that in a long conflict, not only swords, spears, and ships kill. Hunger, confinement, fear, and disease also become weapons, even if no one consciously wields them. Pericles had wanted to save Athens behind walls. But behind these walls, the city found not only shelter, but also ruin. When the worst wave of the plague passed, Athens was no longer the same city. It had lost its most important statesman. It had lost part of its population. And it had lost a piece of its faith in itself. But the war was far from over. On the contrary, without Pericles and after the experience of the plague, Athens entered a new phase. Harder, more nervous, and more prone to risky decisions. The city lived on, but its inner balance was damaged. Sparta had not conquered Athens. But the plague had achieved what Sparta's army could not. It had shaken the city to its core. Chapter 8: War Without a Victor. After the Plague of Athens, nothing was the same as before. The city had not only lost many people, but also its most important political leader. Pericles was dead, and with him disappeared the voice that had repeatedly demanded patience, restraint, and strategic discipline from the Athenians. His basic idea had been clear: no open land battle against Sparta, protection behind the walls, use of the fleet, and slow attrition of the enemy. But after his death, it became increasingly difficult to maintain this course. Athens was wounded, but not defeated. Sparta was strong, but not victorious. This is precisely what gave rise to a new phase of the war, a tough, brutal conflict in which both sides fought, suffered, and achieved successes without achieving the decisive breakthrough. The war was no longer experienced as a great clash between two powers, but as a long series of campaigns, raids, sieges, uprisings, and punitive actions. He ate his way deeper and deeper into the Greek world. The Spartans continued to march into Attica and devastate the land around Athens. For the people there, this meant recurring fear. Fields were destroyed, crops destroyed, houses plundered. But as cruel as these attacks were, they did not decide the war. Athens could still retreat behind its walls. The port of Piraeus remained the lifeline of the city. As long as the fleet functioned, Athens could be supplied with grain, money, and supplies. Athens, in turn, used its ships to carry the war to the coasts of the Peloponnese and other regions. Athenian fleets landed in various places, attacked Spartan allies, disrupted trade routes, and showed that while Sparta was powerful on land, it could not be everywhere at once. This made the war more flexible, but also more confusing. It was not one great battle that decided victory or defeat, but many small operations which, taken together, exhausted the forces of both sides. In this phase, it became particularly clear how differently Athens and Sparta waged war. Sparta long hoped to bring Athens to its knees through devastation, pressure, and loyalty to the alliance. Athens relied on its maritime mobility and financial resources. But both strategies had limits. Sparta could not conquer Athens as long as the walls and the harbor held. Athens could not destroy Sparta as long as its land army and alliance system remained in place. So the war became a struggle of endurance. Who would be exhausted first? Who would lose their allies first? Who would break up politically first? These questions became more important with each passing year. After all, a long war not only burdens armies, but also societies. Citizens are becoming impatient. Allies are beginning to doubt. Costs are rising. Victims are piling up. And at some point, each side wonders whether the original purpose of the war still justifies the continued suffering. In Athens, the political atmosphere also changed after Pericles' death. New leaders emerged, and some of them were much more aggressive. They knew how to appeal to the feelings of the popular assembly: anger at Sparta, pride in Athens' power, fear of weakness, and the desire for revenge. In a democracy, the mood of the citizens could have a great influence on the conduct of the war. This made Athens capable of acting, but also susceptible to impulsive decisions. An example of the harshness of this time was the treatment of rebellious allies. When cities in the Attic League tried to break away from Athens, Athens often reacted brutally. From an Athenian point of view, this was necessary. Every successful uprising could encourage other cities. The Maritime League was the basis of Athens' power, and if it disintegrated, Athens itself would be endangered. But for the affected cities, this logic seemed like oppression. They saw that Athens was defending its freedom while restricting the freedom of others. This tension was particularly evident in the case of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos. The city rose up against Athens, and when the revolt was crushed, the Athenians discussed a terrible punishment. First, they decided to have all adult men in the city killed and to enslave women and children. It was not until the next day that many regretted this extreme decision. A second meeting was convened, and the decision was softened. A second ship was sent to catch up with the first one in time. This episode shows how dangerous the atmosphere during the war had become. Athens vacillated between anger and reason, between imperial harshness and political self-control. The war made decisions more cruel. He accustomed people to regard entire cities as enemies and to consider punishments that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Even on the Spartan side, the war was not without internal tensions. Sparta had to keep its allies together while being careful with its own forces. Long campaigns were risky, because Sparta was not allowed to endanger its internal order. The fear of Helot uprisings always remained present in the background. A state whose full citizens formed a small ruling minority could not afford a permanent weakening. Nevertheless, Sparta did not manage to strike the decisive blow in this phase. Athens remained resilient. The fleet was still strong, and the city still had means and allies. But Athens could not force a final victory either. Every success only seemed to create new problems. A siege won meant new enemies. A suppressed uprising meant new fear of further uprisings. A successful attack on a coast did not mean the surrender of Sparta. The war spread to more and more regions. Cities that were initially only marginally affected were drawn in. Local rivalries were linked to the great conflict between Athens and Sparta. One city supported democratic forces, the other oligarchic. Sometimes internal civil struggles were exacerbated by the Great War. Athens and Sparta stood not only for two military powers, but also for two political directions. Those who wanted power within a city often sought help from one of the two camps. This made the war even more cruel. It was no longer just about Athens against Sparta. In many cities, Greeks fought against Greeks, neighbors against neighbors, political opponents against political opponents. The Great War provided the stage on which old enmities were carried out. And the longer it lasted, the more it changed the moral boundaries. Violence became more common, betrayal more frequent, revenge more brutal. A particularly important moment in this phase of the war was the Athenian success at Pylos and Sphacteria. Athenian troops were able to trap Spartan soldiers there, including genuine Spartan full citizens. That was a shock for Sparta. Spartans were considered men who never gave up. But on Sphacteria they had to surrender. For Athens, this was a great political and psychological victory. Suddenly, Athens had valuable prisoners in its hands and was able to put Sparta under pressure. This success showed that Sparta was vulnerable. The aura of invincibility was damaged. At the same time, he made Athens more self-confident. Many Athenians now believed that the war might be decided in their favor after all. But it is precisely such hopes that could be dangerous. A single success did not mean a final victory. It could also lead to the rejection of peace offers and the continuation of the war, although there would have been a favorable opportunity to end it. Sparta was unsettled by the prisoners of Sphacteria and at times showed willingness to negotiate. But in Athens there were forces that now wanted more. Why make peace when the opponent just seemed weak? Why give in when you had leverage? Thus, a possible path to peace became a reason to continue the war. On the other hand, Sparta also achieved success. Especially the Spartan general Brasidas became an important figure. He was more agile, diplomatic, and courageous than many other Spartan leaders. Brasidas led campaigns in the north of the Aegean Sea and was able to persuade several cities to break away from Athens. This was dangerous for Athens, because there were important allies, resources, and strategic points. If Sparta could weaken Athens' maritime alliance from within, it was a serious threat. The battle for cities like Amphipolis showed that Athens, despite its fleet, could not be strong everywhere at the same time. An alliance system is only as stable as the central power is able to protect it. When allies believed that Athens was vulnerable, the willingness to apostasy grew. Brasidas knew how to present himself not only as a conqueror, but also as a liberator from Athenian rule. In doing so, he hit Athens at a sensitive point. So the war had contradictory results on both sides. Athens could humiliate Sparta, but not defeat it. Sparta could shake Athens' spheres of influence, but it could not break the city itself. Both sides had wins, both had defeats, both had reasons for hope and reasons for concern. This is precisely why the conflict dragged on. For ordinary people, this meant above all suffering without a clear end. Farmers lost their fields. Sailors risked their lives on long voyages. Soldiers died in remote regions whose names many citizens hardly knew. Families waited for returnees who never came. Cities were besieged, starved, or punished. The war became a permanent state. And the longer a war lasts, the harder it becomes to remember peace. An entire generation grew up in uncertainty. Political decisions were shaped by the war. Economic resources flowed into armaments and campaigns. Mistrust became a habit. Even when negotiations were conducted, hardly anyone really believed the opponent. This resulted in a tragic stalemate. Athens was too strong to be defeated quickly. Sparta was too strong to give in. Both powers could harm each other, but neither could eliminate the other once and for all. The war became a mill that crushed people, money, trust, and moral boundaries. At the end of this phase, the longing for peace had grown, not out of reconciliation, but out of exhaustion. Both sides had learned that the quick victory was an illusion. Both had made great sacrifices. Both had to realize that courage alone was not enough if the structure of the war did not allow for a clear winner. But a peace born of exhaustion is often fragile. The causes of conflict do not simply disappear because the combatants get tired. Athens remained a maritime power with an empire. Sparta remained a land power that distrusted Athens' rise. The allies remained dissatisfied. Old wounds remained open. The war without a winner had changed Greece. He had shown how difficult it was to limit power when fear and ambition determined politics. He had made Athens tougher and Sparta more cautious, but not more peaceful. And he had proven that even great victories mean little if they do not open a way out of the conflict. So Greece came close to a peace agreement. But this peace would not be born of trust. It would arise from fatigue. And that's exactly why it should be brittle from the start. Chapter 9: The Fragile Peace. After years of war, Athens and Sparta were exhausted. Both sides had won victories, both had suffered heavy losses, and both had to realize that the quick, decisive triumph had failed to materialize. Athens had stood firm despite the plague, devastation, and uprisings. Sparta, despite its dreaded land army, had not been able to conquer the city. The war had dragged on without giving a clear answer to the most important question: who should be the leading power in Greece? People were tired. In Athens, Many citizens had had enough of constant campaigns, political tensions, and economic strains. The memory of the plague was still fresh. Many families had to mourn deaths, and confidence in an easy victory had dwindled. In Sparta, too, the desire for a break grew. The prisoners of Sphacteria had been a deep humiliation for Sparta. The fact that Spartan full citizens were in Athenian hands put pressure on the leadership. For a society that relied so heavily on honor, discipline, and the image of unwavering bravery, this situation was hardly bearable. At the same time, Sparta had achieved successes in the north of the Aegean Sea through the general Brasidas. Several cities had broken away from Athens or had become unsafe. Amphipolis in particular was a painful loss for Athens, because this city was strategically and economically important. The war had thus created leverage on both sides. Athens held Spartan prisoners. Sparta had shaken Athens' sphere of influence. It was precisely these mutual successes that made negotiations possible. Neither side was completely defeated, but both had something they wanted to give back or secure. In this situation, the desire for peace gained weight. On the Athenian side, Nicias played an important role, a cautious and wealthy politician who stood for balance rather than risky adventures. He had a reputation for being level-headed, and many Athenians associated him with the hope of peace. After years of uncertainty, a man like Nicias seemed to many to be the antithesis of those politicians who constantly demanded new campaigns and tougher measures. In Sparta, too, there were reasons to end the war. The return of the prisoners was a central concern. Moreover, it was not certain how long the allies were willing to fight a war that did not bring a final victory. Sparta had to be careful. A long war could put a strain on one's own order. The danger of unrest among the Helots always remained in the background. For Sparta, stability was more important than glory at any price. This is how the so-called Peace of Nicias came about. He was supposed to end the war and create peace between Athens and Sparta for 50 years. On paper, this sounded like a big step. Prisoners were to be returned, conquered places partially evacuated, and former conditions restored. After all the bloodshed, a new order was to emerge in which both sides would protect their interests and open war would end. But even here the central problem became apparent. A treaty can stop fighting, but it cannot simply extinguish mistrust. Athens and Sparta signed peace, but many of their allies were dissatisfied. Corinth, Thebes, and Megara in particular did not feel sufficiently taken into account by the agreements. These cities had their own interests, their own losses, and their own enmities. For them, the war had not only been a conflict between Athens and Sparta. They had suffered themselves, fought themselves, and even pinned their hopes on the outcome. If Athens and Sparta made peace without fulfilling all the demands of their allies, new trouble would arise. This shows a fundamental weakness of the Greek alliance systems. Athens and Sparta were the leading powers, but they could not always fully control their allies. Each city had its own pride, its own policies, and its own scores to settle. A peace between the great powers therefore did not automatically mean peace in the whole of Greece. On the contrary, some allies felt betrayed. The implementation of peace was also difficult. Some cities were to be returned, others refused. Some agreements remained unclear, others were delayed. What might seem clear on a contract board was full of obstacles in reality. Who should force a city to return if its inhabitants did not want to? Who guaranteed that an ally would obey? What happened when one side claimed that the other was not fulfilling its obligations? This resulted in a peace that was not stable from the beginning. The weapons were partially suspended, but the mistrust remained alive. Athens wondered whether Sparta could or really wanted to control its allies. Sparta wondered if Athens was holding back its power only temporarily. Allies wondered if they had been abandoned by their protecting powers. No one really trusted that the new order would last. It was particularly problematic that the deeper causes of the war had not been resolved. Athens remained a powerful maritime power with a large alliance system. Sparta remained the leading land power and continued to view Athens' influence with concern. The contrast between the two had not disappeared. It was only temporarily covered. The fear of the power of the other persisted. And as long as this fear remained, every incident could become a crisis again. The Peace of Nicaeas was therefore less a real peace agreement than a pause. It ended the first major phase of the Peloponnesian War, but it did not bring reconciliation. The hostility was too deep, the interests were too opposed, and the political camps were too tense. Many Greeks had had enough of the war, but they had not learned to trust each other. In Athens, the peace led to a new political uncertainty. The city had survived, but it was not unchallenged. Some saw peace as a sensible step, others found it unsatisfactory. Athens had remained proud and ambitious. Many citizens wanted not only security, but influence, fame, and confirmation of their own greatness. A peace that did not bring clear Athenian superiority seemed to some like a missed opportunity. In Sparta, the situation was also complicated. The return of the prisoners was important, but the discontent of the allies weakened confidence in Sparta's leadership. If Sparta made peace while important partners were against it, it could damage its reputation. A leading power must not only deter enemies, but also convince allies. Sparta only partially succeeded in doing so. In this atmosphere, a phase of political maneuvers began. Alliances were reconsidered, contacts were made, old rivalries revived. Open war was slowed down, but diplomacy became all the more intense. Cities are looking for advantages, safeguards, and new opportunities. The Greek world did not seem like a space that came to rest, but like a field on which everyone prepared the next movement. What was particularly dangerous was that peace left a void for ambitious politicians to fill. When a war ends with a clear decision, the room for maneuver is often limited. But an indecisive peace creates uncertainty. It offers space for people who claim that their own city can achieve more if it acts more courageously, harder, or more skillfully. In Athens, such a figure was soon to come to the fore: Alcibiades. Alcibiades embodied many things that fascinated and at the same time endangered Athens. He was ambitious, charismatic, rich, talented, and unpredictable. For him, the Peace of Nicaeas was not a final state, but a political stage. He understood that many Athenians were dissatisfied. They did not want to simply wait while Sparta and its allies reorganized themselves. They wanted to act, gain influence, and show that Athens continued to be the driving force of Greece. This made the fragile peace even more unstable. Nicaeas stood for caution and preservation. Alcibiades stood for movement, risk, and brilliant opportunities. These two attitudes clashed in Athens. The city had to decide whether to consolidate peace or seek new opportunities. As is so often the case in the Peloponnesian War, the most dangerous temptation was not desperation, but ambition. Because Athens was still powerful despite all the losses. His fleet was strong, his self-confidence unbroken, his view of the world still wide. Many Athenians believed that their city was destined for great things. Peace could therefore quickly have the effect of a standstill. And stagnation was hard to bear for a city like Athens. The situation also remained tense outside Athens. In the Peloponnese, in Boeotia, in the Aegean, and in the colonies, the old conflicts continued to have an effect. Democratic and oligarchic groups struggled for influence in various cities. Each side hoped for support from Athens or Sparta. Thus, violence could break out even without an official war. The Peace of Nicaeas held back the main powers, but it did not pacify the Greek world. That is the tragedy of this peace. He came too late to save trust and too early to really decide the conflict. It was necessary because both sides were exhausted. But he was weak because neither side was inwardly willing to give up the rivalry. Athens and Sparta had learned to fear each other. And this fear did not disappear through signatures. For ordinary people, however, peace initially meant relief. Less campaigning, less devastation, less immediate fear. Farmers could hope to return to their fields. Families could hope that sons and fathers would not have to move out again immediately. Traders could hope that routes would become safer. But underneath this relief lay uncertainty. Everyone knew that peace was weak. Real peace needs more than tiredness. He needs the conviction that cooperation is better than fighting again. It was precisely this conviction that was missing. Athens did not want to limit its power. Sparta did not want to accept Athens' power permanently. The allies did not feel sufficiently protected. Political tensions within many cities remained. Thus, the Peace of Nicias became a stopover. It did not mark the end of history, but only the end of a first chapter of the war. The weapons fell silent more quietly, but they were not put away. The speakers spoke of peace, but new plans were already emerging in the minds of many politicians. The contracts were in place, but the rivalry lived on. Greece breathed a sigh of relief, but it did not heal. Under the surface, mistrust, ambition, and old wounds once again accumulated. And it was soon to become clear that a fragile peace can sometimes be more dangerous than open war. Because in open war, everyone knows their opponent. In the fragile peace, everyone believes that they still have time while the next catastrophe is already being prepared. Chapter 10: Alcibiades, Genius, Traitor, Survivalist. At a time when Athens was vacillating between peace and new war, a man who stood for the unrest of this era like no other came to the fore: Alcibiades. He was young, rich, handsome, ambitious, clever, and dangerous. Some admired him, others mistrusted him. For some he was a political genius, for others a narcissistic adventurer who was only looking for his own fame. But he left no one indifferent. Alcibiades came from a noble Athenian family. His origins alone gave him prestige, but it alone does not explain his rise. In Athens there were many men from rich houses, but few had a charisma like him. Alcibiades knew how to attract attention. He appeared self-confident, spoke skillfully, and knew how to impress people. He loved the glamour, the competition, and the risk. For a city like Athens, which was itself proud, ambitious, and restless, he almost became a mirror image. At the same time, Alcibiades was elusive. He could be charming, but also ruthless. He could seem courageous, but also calculating. He spoke of Athens' greatness, but many wondered whether he was really serving the city or only himself. It was precisely this mixture that made him so fascinating. Alcibiades was not an easy hero and not an ordinary traitor. He was a figure full of contradictions, and that is precisely why he fits so well into the time after the Peace of Nicias. This peace had officially calmed the war, but not ended it. Many Athenians found it unsatisfactory. Sparta was not defeated, Athens' power was not clearly confirmed, and the rivalry remained. Nicias, after whom peace was named, stood for caution. He wanted stability and calm. Alcibiades, on the other hand, stood for movement. He didn't want to wait. He wanted to lead Athens to new ventures and make himself immortal in the process. In Athenian democracy, a man like Alcibiades could gain great influence if he convinced the popular assembly. And that's exactly what he succeeded. He understood the desires of many Athenians, the desire for glory, for power, for confirmation, for the feeling that Athens had not only survived, but could continue to determine the fate of Greece. After years of plague, war, and uncertainty, this message was seductive. Alcibiades did not promise a small policy. He thought big, maybe too big. His political opposition to Nicias became increasingly clear. Nicias warned of unnecessary risks. He knew that Athens had already suffered a lot. The city was powerful, but not invulnerable. A new major conflict could become dangerous. Alcibiades, on the other hand, saw weakness in hesitation. From his point of view, Athens could not remain passive while Sparta and other powers strengthened their positions. If you want to lead, you have to act. This contrast was more than a dispute between two politicians. It was a quarrel between two souls of Athens. One side was tired of the war and sought safety. The other side was proud, restless, and wanted more. Athens had become accustomed to grandeur. It was difficult to settle for a peace that did not bring a clear triumph. Alcibiades understood this impatience and made it his political force. He was not only a speaker, but also a master of intrigue. He made contacts, played alliances against each other, and was always looking for ways to weaken Sparta's influence. His intervention in the Peloponnese became particularly important. There he tried to move cities and alliances in such a way that Sparta came under pressure. He supported a policy that was intended to provide Athens with new partners and isolate Sparta diplomatically. But not all of his plans were successful. At Mantinea, a major battle took place, in which Sparta once again proved its military strength. This was a setback for Athens' hopes. Sparta showed that, despite all the difficulties, it continued to be a feared land power. For Alcibiades, however, defeat did not mean the end of his ambitions. He thought ahead, looked for new opportunities, and soon turned his gaze to a destination that went far beyond Greece, Sicily. Sicily was rich, large, and strategically important. There were powerful Greek cities, above all Syracuse. For many Athenians, the island was far away, but not uninteresting. Those who gained influence in Sicily could gain access to grain, wealth, and new positions of power. Alcibiades saw this as a tremendous opportunity. He imagined that Athens could not only dominate the Aegean Sea, but would extend its influence far to the west. The idea was bold. Perhaps she was visionary. Maybe she was insane. This was exactly where the problem lay. Alcibiades could see possibilities that others did not see, but he often underestimated the dangers or consciously accepted them. For him, size without risk was hardly conceivable. For Nicias, on the other hand, such an undertaking was a nightmare. Sicily was far away, Syracuse was strong, and Athens already had enough enemies. An expedition there could overstretch the city's strength. A decisive dispute broke out in the People's Assembly. Nicias issued an urgent warning about the company. He tried to convince the Athenians of the danger, but his warnings had an unintended effect. When he explained how large the necessary force would have to be in order to be successful, it did not deter the Athenians. On the contrary, many thought that if you only plan big enough, you can win. So a warning almost became a reinforcement of the plan. Alcibiades took advantage of the mood. He spoke of possibilities, of fame, of Athens' destiny. He did not present the expedition as a reckless adventure, but as the logical next step of a great power. If Athens hesitates, others will benefit. If Athens acts, it could expand its influence tremendously. The popular assembly finally decided in favor of the expedition. Athens would leave for Sicily. For Alcibiades, this was the highlight of his rise. He became one of the commanders of the enterprise, along with Nicias and Lamachos. But even before the expedition really began, a scandal occurred in Athens that changed everything. In the city, numerous Hermes were mutilated in one night. Hermes were religious stone monuments that were associated with the god Hermes, among other things. This act shook Athens deeply. It was seen not only as vandalism, but as a bad omen, perhaps even a sign of a conspiracy against democracy. Suspicion soon fell on Alcibiades and his circle. Whether he was actually involved is still uncertain today, but in the agitated atmosphere of Athens, suspicion was enough to become dangerous. Alcibiades initially demanded to be allowed to defend himself in court immediately before the fleet sailed. But his opponents wanted to postpone the proceedings. Perhaps they hoped that his absence would weaken him politically. Alcibiades sailed with the expedition to Sicily, while in Athens the accusations continued to grow. Then he was called back to answer in court. For a man like Alcibiades, this was life-threatening. He knew that his enemies were powerful and that the mood could tip against him. So he did something that would forever mark his reputation. He fled. Even worse, Alcibiades defected to Sparta. For Athens, this was betrayal. A man who had just helped plan Athens' great expedition now offered his knowledge to the worst opponent. In Sparta, he became a valuable advisor. Among other things, he recommended that the Spartans put more pressure on Athens and permanently occupy a base in Attica. The occupation of Decelea in particular was to have serious consequences for Athens later on. Alcibiades thus finally became the dazzling and dark figure of the war. He was Athenian, but he helped Sparta. Later, he would even get in touch with Persia and try again to change his position. Again and again he changed sides. Again and again he survived political storms. Again and again he found a way back into the game. That's why he seems like a survivor in a world where loyalty often counted less than power, opportunity, and personal skill. But Alcibiades should not only be regarded as a traitor. This is precisely what makes it so interesting historically. He was a symptom of his time. The Peloponnesian War had shifted the moral boundaries. Cities betrayed alliances. Politicians took advantage of crises, democracies made cruel decisions, oligarchs sought outside help, and everywhere power became more important than trust. Alcibiades embodied this development in a single person. He was brilliant, but dangerous. He could see big connections, but his own ambitions often got in the way. He loved Athens, perhaps, but he loved his own glory even more. He could serve a city as long as it served him. When she threatened him, he looked for a new stage. For some, this was shameless. For others, it was political wisdom in a merciless world. His influence on the war was enormous. Without him, Athens might not have decided on the Sicily Expedition with the same enthusiasm. Without his betrayal, Sparta might not have acted so specifically against Athens' weaknesses later on. Alcibiades was not the sole reason for Athens' catastrophes, but he accelerated developments that were dangerous anyway. It condensed the tragedy of Athens. The city admired talent, oratory, ambition, and greatness. Alcibiades possessed all this in abundance. But it is precisely these qualities that could become destructive if they were not tamed by moderation and responsibility. Athens wanted greatness, and Alcibiades promised it. Athens wanted glory, and Alcibiades showed a way to get there. But this path did not lead to secure rule, but to one of the greatest disasters in ancient history. At the end of this chapter, therefore, there is an uncomfortable question. Was Alcibiades an extraordinary man who was mistreated by his city? Or was he a dangerous opportunist whose ambition led Athens to ruin? Maybe he was both. And that is precisely why he became one of the most fascinating figures of the Peloponnesian War. A man who shone everywhere, but never really remained faithful anywhere. A politician who recognized opportunities, but unleashed risks. An Athenian who wanted to make Athens great and yet contributed to weakening it. With Alcibiades, the war enters a new phase. It is no longer just caution and defense that determine politics, but big dreams, risky plans, and personal power games. The fragile peace was over. Athens' gaze was now directed to the west, to Sicily. And there was not glory waiting there, but a catastrophe. Chapter 11. The Sicily Expedition. The Sicily Expedition did not begin like a desperate step, but like a dream of greatness. Despite war, plague, and political tensions, Athens was still a powerful city. His fleet dominated large parts of the Aegean, his self-confidence was not broken, and many citizens continued to believe that Athens was destined for more than just the defense of its previous empire. The gaze was now directed far to the west, to a large island that seemed rich, strategically important, and full of possibilities: Sicily. Sicily was not a foreign world for the Greeks. For a long time, there had been Greek cities, trade connections, and political rivalries there. Syracuse, in particular, was powerful. The city was rich, well located, and had considerable military power. Whoever controlled or weakened Syracuse could gain considerable influence in Sicily. For Athens, this sounded tempting. Sicily meant grain, wealth, new allies, and perhaps even the opportunity to meet Sparta supporters in the west. But there was a great distance between Athens and Sicily. A campaign there was not a small intervention, but a huge undertaking. Ships, soldiers, oarsmen, supplies, horses, money and experienced commanders had to be moved over long distances. The farther an army fought from home, the more dangerous any mistake became. Supplies could be difficult, allies could be unreliable, and the opponents on the ground knew the land and ports better than the attackers. Nicias therefore warned urgently against this plan. He saw the risks more clearly than many others. Athens still had enemies in Greece. Peace with Sparta was uncertain. The war could flare up again at any time. Anyone who sent a huge expedition to Sicily in such a situation was putting a great deal at stake. Nicias understood that a great power can fail not only because it does too little, but also because it wants too much at once. But his warnings did not succeed in the euphoria, and Alcibiades and his followers painted a different future. They saw the expedition as an opportunity to raise Athens' power to a new level. Syracuse was to be weakened, Sicily was to be won, the wealth of the island was to be used, and Athens' fame was to be increased. For many citizens, this sounded like a continuation of what Athens had long been about: courage, movement, naval power, and the ability to think further than its opponents. When the decision was made, Athens prepared one of the largest undertakings in its history. The fleet that sailed was impressive. Ships were ready, soldiers boarded, oarsmen took their places, and the city gathered to watch the departure. For many, it must have been an overwhelming sight: a massive naval force, brilliantly equipped, carried by the pride of a city that considered itself unstoppable. But even before the departure, a shadow lay over the company. The scandal over the mutilated Hermes had shaken Athens, and Alcibiades had come under suspicion. He initially sailed along, but was then called back to answer in court. Instead of facing the trial, he fled. The expedition thus lost one of its most important supporters, and at the same time the man who had embodied it most politically. This was a shock for Athens, a heavy blow for the expedition. Nicias and Lamachos remained behind as central commanders, but the two stood for very different attitudes. Lamachos was rather determined and direct. He wanted to act quickly and attack Syracuse as quickly as possible before the city could fully prepare. Nicias, on the other hand, was more cautious. He hesitated, checked, waited, and looked for secure foundations. In such a dangerous campaign, caution could be valuable, but too much hesitation could be deadly. This is exactly what became the problem. The Athenians came to Sicily, but they did not take advantage of the initial shock decisively enough. Syracuse had time to collect itself. Allies were sought, defenses improved, and the situation became more complicated for Athens. What might have been decided by a quick blow turned into a long and difficult siege. Syracuse was not an easy target. The city was big, rich, and resilient. Its citizens were ready to defend themselves. In addition, she was not isolated. There were many cities in Sicily with their own interests, and not all of them wanted to support Athens. Some feared Athens' power more than Syracuse. Others waited to see who would appear stronger. Athens therefore not only had to fight, but also convince. And the longer the campaign lasted, the less impressive the Athenian strength appeared. Nevertheless, the Athenians initially achieved success. They began to encircle Syracuse, built fortifications, and tried to put pressure on the city from land and sea. A siege was a battle of patience, technique, and perseverance. Walls were erected, counterwalls were built, attacks were carried out, supplies were secured. Every little progress could be important. But every lost day gave Syracuse new chances. Then Lamachos fell in battle. His death was another heavy loss. This left Nicias as the dominant figure, the very man who had originally rejected the expedition. That was a bitter irony. The company's most cautious opponent now had to run a company in whose success he himself had never really believed. In Athens, however, they did not want to admit that the expedition had come to a dangerous standstill. Instead of considering retreating, reinforcements were sent. Other ships, soldiers, and commanders were sent to Sicily, including Demosthenes, an experienced and energetic general. The hope was to force the decision with renewed strength. But reinforcements also meant that Athens tied up even more resources in an increasingly risky adventure. Meanwhile, Syracuse received help from outside. The support of the Spartan Gylippos was particularly decisive. He brought military experience, new confidence, and clear leadership. His arrival changed the situation. Syracuse became more courageous, more organized, and more offensive. Suddenly, it was no longer just the Syracusans who were on the defensive. The Athenians themselves came under increasing pressure. The campaign began to turn against Athens. The besiegers became besieged. The Athenians had tied up a huge force far from their homeland, but their position was becoming increasingly uncertain. Illnesses, supply difficulties, exhaustion, and hostile resistance weakened morale. The dream of quick conquest had long since disappeared. It was replaced by a tough fight for survival. After his arrival, Demosthenes realized that quick action was needed. He attempted a night attack on strategically important heights near Syracuse. At first, the plan seemed to succeed, but confusion ensued in the darkness. Troops lost their bearings. Friend and foe were difficult to distinguish. Panic spread. The attack failed. For the Athenians, this was a decisive setback. After this failure, Demosthenes urged the retreat. He understood that the expedition could hardly be saved. Nicias hesitated again. He feared the reaction of the Athenians at home if he returned without success. Besides, he might have hoped for a change in the situation. This hesitation became disastrous. In a campaign far from home, the right time to retreat can be just as important as the right time to attack. Athens missed it. Then came an event that further delayed the decision: a lunar eclipse. In the ancient world, such signs were often interpreted religiously. Nicias, who was pious and cautious, had the planned withdrawal postponed. This may seem incomprehensible to modern viewers, but for many people at the time, divine signs were a serious part of political and military decisions. This delay gave Syracuse even more time. Eventually, the port of Syracuse became a trap. The Athenians had to try to break out with their fleet. But the Syracusans had learned to fight against the Athenian ships. In the narrow waters, the Athenians could not fully exploit their usual mobility. The naval battle in the harbor turned into a disaster. Athens, the great naval power, was defeated on the water. For the men who had believed in the superiority of the Athenian fleet all their lives, this must have been an unimaginable shock. When the eruption at sea failed, the only option was to retreat overland. The once proud expedition turned into a desperate march. Soldiers, exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, tried to save themselves through enemy territory. But Syracuse and its allies pursued them. The Athenians were far from their homeland, without a secure supply, without a fleet, without hope of a quick rescue. The retreat turned into a disaster. Troops were separated, encircled, and defeated. Many died. Others surrendered. Nicias and Demosthenes were captured and eventually executed. The surviving soldiers were taken to the quarries of Syracuse, where they were held in appalling conditions. Hunger, thirst, illness, and exhaustion claimed further victims. Few ever returned home. For Athens, the news of the defeat was hard to comprehend. A huge fleet, a large army, enormous funds, and countless hopes were lost. The city had lost not only a campaign, but a large part of its military strength. The dream of Western expansion was shattered. Worse still, Athens' enemies now knew that the great naval power was vulnerable. The Sicily Expedition became one of the biggest turning points of the Peloponnesian War. It showed how dangerous ambition can become when it ignores the limits of one's own strength. Athens had not acted out of weakness, but out of arrogance. It had believed that it could expand its power further and further. But Sicily was too far, Syracuse too strong, the leadership too divided, and the risk too great. In the end, Only a bitter picture remained of the brilliant departure. A proud city had sent its best ships and men on a distant adventure, and hardly any of it returned. The war was not decided, but Athens was badly hit. His enemies drew new hope. His allies began to doubt. Its citizens had to ask themselves how a democracy that discussed so much and was so proud of its wisdom could have made such a fateful decision. The Sicily Expedition began as a promise of glory. It ended up as a warning. Not every big plan is greatness. Sometimes it is only the beginning of the downfall. Chapter 12: The Decline of Athens. After the catastrophe in Sicily, a mood hung over Athens that had little to do with the self-confident awakening of earlier years. The city, which had once believed it could extend its power far into the west, now had to realize that it had suffered one of the worst blows in its history. Entire naval formations were lost, thousands of men were dead or taken prisoner, experienced generals had been killed or executed, and enormous amounts of money, material, and political hope had been destroyed. The news of the defeat hit Athens like an earthquake. Many did not want to believe it at first. The extent of the disaster was too great, too unimaginable. The thought that an expedition that had begun with so much pride and effort had been almost completely wiped out. But little by little, survivors, merchants, and messengers confirmed what no one wanted to hear. The army was destroyed, the fleet lost, Nicias and Demosthenes dead, the prisoners in Syracuse miserably perished or enslaved. For Athens, this defeat meant more than just the loss of a campaign. It shook the foundation of Athenian power. The fleet had always been Athens' greatest strength. It had supplied the city, held the empire together, and frightened the opponents. But now there was a lack of ships, rowers, and experienced sailors. A fleet cannot be replaced overnight. You need wood, money, shipyards, equipment, and above all, people who know how to fight at sea. Athens could build new ships, but it could not simply bring back the lost experience. The situation was also threatening financially. The long war had already burdened the coffers, and the Sicily expedition had devoured enormous resources. Now Athens had to organize its defenses, build new ships, hold allies, and prevent possible uprisings at the same time. Each of these points cost money. But just now many allies began to doubt whether Athens was still strong enough to protect or coerce them. For Athens' empire was not only based on admiration, it was based on power. Many cities in the Attic League paid taxes because Athens obliged them to do so. Some accepted the Athenian leadership out of fear, others out of habit, and still others because they saw no better alternative. But after Sicily, the situation changed. If Athens was vulnerable, if its fleet could be defeated, if its resources were exhausted, then resistance suddenly seemed possible. This is exactly what became one of the greatest dangers. Allies began to break away from Athens or think about an uprising. The situation became particularly critical in Ionia and on the coasts of Asia Minor. Cities that had long been under Athenian influence now saw an opportunity. They knew that Sparta and its allies would take advantage of Athens' weakness. Those who changed sides now might be able to regain their independence or receive better conditions. Sparta recognized the opportunity. For a long time, Sparta had problems scoring Athens decisively. The Athenian walls, the harbor, and the fleet had protected the city. But after Sicily, Athens was no longer the same power. Sparta could now be more aggressive. Above all, Sparta received advice that proved to be particularly effective. Athens was not only to be threatened occasionally by invasions of Attica, but to come under permanent pressure. Here Alcibiades again played an important role. After fleeing Athens and joining Sparta, he gave valuable clues to the Spartans. One of his most important pieces of advice was to occupy the town of Decline in Attica permanently. This measure hit Athens hard. Decline was located in such a way that the surrounding area of Athens could be constantly threatened from there. Unlike previous Spartan incursions, which were temporary, the occupation of Decline meant a permanent state of uncertainty. This was devastating for Athens. Agriculture in Attica was further damaged. People could not use their goods safely, and the city became more dependent on imports. It was also particularly serious that many slaves fled, including workers from the silver mines of Laurion. These mines had been economically important for Athens. When workers were lost and revenues fell, the financial situation deteriorated further. Athens was now trapped in a dangerous double burden. On the one hand, it had to hold its empire together and build new fleets. On the other hand, it was permanently threatened at home. The city had still not been conquered, but it was increasingly put on the defensive. The strength of the walls remained, but life behind them became more difficult. The enemies of Athens smelled blood. Corinth, Thebes, and other opponents saw the opportunity to weaken Athens once and for all. But a new factor became even more important: Persia. The Persian Empire had long been the great external enemy of the Greeks. In the Persian Wars, many Greeks had fought together against this power. Now, however, Persia indirectly interfered in the internal Greek war. For the Persian satraps in Asia Minor, the conflict between Athens and Sparta was an opportunity. As long as the Greeks fought against each other, they were easier to influence. Persia was able to give money, make alliances, and try to regain lost influence in the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Sparta, which had previously been strong mainly as a land power, needed money to build up a fleet. Persian silver was able to do just that. This development was particularly dangerous for Athens. As long as Sparta did not have a strong fleet, Athens' greatest strength remained. But when Sparta was able to build ships and pay sailors with the help of Persian funds, the balance of power changed. The war could now be decided at sea, exactly where Athens had previously been superior. Persia did not have to intervene with large armies itself. It was enough to support Athens' opponents financially. Athens was thus faced with a new reality. The war was no longer just a struggle between the Athenian fleet and the Spartan land army. It became a complex power game in which money, diplomacy, betrayal, and alliances played an increasingly important role. Athens' former advantages had not disappeared, but they were getting smaller. The city had to fight harder to preserve what used to be taken for granted. Athens also fell into a crisis domestically. Defeats always create the question of guilt. Who would have wanted the Sicily Expedition? Who had made the wrong decision? Was democracy itself responsible because it had allowed itself to be driven by speakers, hopes, and emotions? Such questions became dangerous. Some wealthy and influential Athenians began to openly or secretly question the democratic order. They believed that a smaller group of experienced men could lead the city better than the People's Assembly. The pressure of the war thus opened the door to political upheaval. When a democracy is successful, its openness acts like strength. When she experiences disasters, her opponents accuse her of recklessness and disorder. In Athens, tension between democratic forces and oligarchic groups grew. Some even hoped to achieve better conditions with Persia or Sparta by changing the constitution. Thus, Athens' decline became visible not only militarily, but also politically. The city no longer fought only against external enemies, but also against internal doubts. Unity, which would have been so important in times of crisis, crumbled. Mistrust spread. Who else was loyal? Who negotiated secretly? Who used the city's hardship for their own political goals? And yet Athens showed astonishing resilience in this phase. Many other cities would probably have collapsed after a disaster like Sicily. Athens did not do that. It built new ships, organized new funds, called on citizens and allies to make an effort, and continued to fight. This tenacity shows how deep Athens' power structures still were. The city was badly wounded, but it was not dead. It is precisely this mixture of weakness and resistance that makes this phase so dramatic. Athens was no longer the undisputed power of the Aegean, but it could still be dangerous. It had suffered enormous losses, but it still had experience, organization, and the will to survive. His enemies had to realize that even a badly hit opponent is not automatically defeated. Nevertheless, the direction of the war had changed. Before Sicily, Athens could have dreamed of expanding its power enormously. After Sicily, the main concern was to prevent their own collapse. Imperial ambition turned into defense. Big plans turned into damage limitation. The dream of the West turned into the fight for the Aegean. The decline of Athens was therefore not a sudden fall, but a slow bleeding out. Ships were lost, allies fell away, money became scarce, the surrounding area remained threatened, political tensions increased, and Sparta learned to attack Athens' strengths with new means. Every single crisis was perhaps still manageable. Together, however, they formed a burden that became heavier and heavier. During this time, Athens had to realize that power is not just about winning victories. Power also consists of coping with losses. And this was precisely where the big question lay. How many more losses could Athens bear before its order, its empire, and its morality collapsed? The city had once believed that the sea gave it security, but now new fleets arose against them. She had believed that her empire was stable, but now allies turned their backs. She had believed that her democracy could overcome any crisis, but now this democracy itself has been called into question. Athens continued to fight, but the shine had darkened. The pride had remained, but it was mixed with fear. The walls were still standing, the ships were still sailing, the people's assembly was still in session. But everyone felt that the war had entered a new phase. Athens no longer determined the rhythm of events. The events drove Athens before it. Chapter 13: Sparta Strikes Back. After the catastrophe in Sicily, many opponents of Athens believed that the moment had come. Athens was badly hit, its fleet weakened, its finances strained, and its self-confidence shaken. But despite everything, the city did not collapse. She built new ships, held on to her empire, and continued to fight. For Sparta, this was an important realization. Athens would not go down by a big defeat alone. If Sparta wanted to win the war, it had to attack where Athens was strongest, at sea. That was a huge change. Since the beginning of the conflict, Sparta had relied primarily on its land power. The Spartan hoplites were feared, their discipline was legendary, and in the open field hardly any Greek army could resist them. But against Athens, this strength was not enough. The city was protected by its walls, connected to the port of Piraeus, and could be supplied by sea. As long as Athens' fleet controlled the sea routes, Sparta was able to devastate Attica without achieving the decisive victory. So Sparta had to learn to wage war differently. It had to build a fleet, pay sailors, equip ships, and find commanders who were successful on the water. That wasn't easy. Naval power does not emerge overnight. Athens had gained decades of experience. Its citizens, oarsmen, strategists, and shipyards were accustomed to naval warfare. Sparta, on the other hand, was a land power with a completely different tradition. But Sparta had something that was now becoming increasingly important: allies, Athenian weaknesses, and Persian money. Persia watched the war with great interest. It was useful for the Persian Empire if the Greek cities weakened each other. A strong, united Greece could be dangerous. A Greece that was exhausted in civil wars and alliance struggles was more easily influenced. Especially in Asia Minor, Persia wanted to regain its influence. Many Greek cities that were under Athenian influence or were part of the Athenian sphere of influence. If Athens was weakened, Persia could benefit. This created a connection that would have seemed unthinkable in the past. Sparta, once part of the Greek resistance against Persia, accepted Persian support. This was morally sensitive, but strategically effective. With Persian silver, Sparta could build ships and pay oarsmen. And in naval warfare, money was decisive. A fleet needed not only courage, but permanent financing. Men had to receive their pay, ships had to be repaired, ports had to be secured, and supplies had to be organized. For Athens, this development was dangerous. Until now, it had been able to trust that Sparta was inferior at sea. But now the balance began to shift. Athens could no longer be sure that its fleet would remain superior everywhere. At the same time, it had to hold its empire together, because more and more allies doubted Athens' strength. When cities in the Aegean Sea or on the coast of Asia Minor fell away, Athens lost not only influence, but also money, ports, and strategic bases. The war now shifted more to Ionia and the eastern Aegean. Many of the coming battles were decided there. Athens had to hold on to its allies or win them back. Sparta tried to promote uprisings and present itself as a liberator from Athenian rule. For many cities, this was tempting. Over time, Athens had developed from a protecting power to an imperial power. Anyone who had to pay Athenian tributes or experienced Athenian control could now see Sparta as an opportunity. But Sparta was not only liberators. Sparta also pursued its own interests. Many cities that wanted to shake off Athens soon had to realize that they were not simply released into complete freedom. They often only exchanged the pressure of one power against the influence of another. The Peloponnesian War was no longer a struggle between freedom and oppression. It was a struggle for supremacy, in which both sides used fine words but engaged in hard power politics. In Athens, the new situation exacerbated the internal crisis. After Sicily, oligarchic groups had gained influence. Some claimed that democracy had led the city to disaster. They wanted to limit political power to fewer men and hoped to act more efficiently or gain support from Persia. Thus, there was a temporary oligarchic overthrow in Athens, in which the rule of the so-called 400 was established. This development shows how deeply the war had shaken the city. Athens, which had repeatedly invoked its democracy, temporarily lost part of this order. But democracy was not completely broken. The fleet in particular played a decisive role. Many rowers and sailors continued to stand by the democratic tradition, because it was they who had gained political weight through the fleet. On the island of Samos, where a large part of the Athenian fleet was stationed, democratic forces held out. Thus, the fleet became the heart of Athens not only militarily, but also politically. While insecurity reigned in the city itself, the fleet remained a center of resistance to oligarchic rule. The sailors and soldiers understood that their own influence was closely linked to democracy. Without democracy, without a popular assembly, without the importance of the poorer citizens as rowers, their political position could have been weakened. In this tense situation, Alcibiades appeared on the stage again. The man who had left Athens, advised Sparta, and later allied himself with Persian circles, now sought his way back. For many Athenians, he was a traitor, but at the same time, he was considered capable, clever, and diplomatically skilled. In a desperate situation, even former enemies could seem useful again. Alcibiades promised influence in Persia and military skill. Parts of the Athenian fleet saw an opportunity in him. His return to Athenian politics was typical of this war. Loyalties had become fragile, old enmities could shift, and benefits often counted more than moral clarity. Alcibiades actually helped Athens to achieve success again. Under his participation, the Athenians achieved important victories, including at Cyzicus. These successes showed once again that Athens, despite all the losses, was not finished. The city was still able to strike back. Sparta had to realize that the war was not automatically won, even after Sicily. Athens remained dangerous as long as it had enough ships, experienced men, and political energy. But the long-term advantage still began to shift in Sparta's favor. With Persian support, Sparta was able to renew its fleet, compensate for losses, and continue to exert pressure. Athens, on the other hand, had to do more and more on its own, while its resources dwindled. A decisive man on the Spartan side finally became Lysander. He was not a typical Spartan general in the old style. Lysander understood the importance of diplomacy, money, and personal influence. He established close relations with Persian rulers, especially with Cyrus the Younger, who gave him financial support. With these funds, Lysander was able to build a fleet that consisted not only of ships, but also of paid, motivated crews. That was a crucial difference. In naval warfare, the loyalty of rowers and sailors could depend on regular pay. If Sparta could pay more pay than Athens, it could attract and retain men. Persian money thus became a weapon, almost as important as spears and ram spurs. Athens had long lived on the tribute of its allies. Now it sensed how dangerous an opposing power could become if it had foreign sources of finance at its disposal. Lysander also understood that Athens did not necessarily have to be defeated in a major battle in the countryside. Athens' supplies, its fleet and its allies had to be hit. If Athens lost the sea, it lost everything. The city needed grain imports, especially from the Black Sea region. It needed free sea routes and safe harbors. A Spartan fleet, threatening these connections, was able to slowly strangle Athens. Nevertheless, the war remained changeable. Athens still won battles, lost others, appointed generals, condemned them, recalled them, or punished them. Political nervousness increased. A particularly tragic example was the Battle of the Arginuses. The Athenians won an important naval victory there, but after the battle not all shipwrecked people could be rescued and not all the dead recovered due to a storm. In Athens, this led to outrage. Several victorious generals were accused and executed. This episode shows how damaged Athens' political culture has become. Even a victory could turn into a crisis. The People's Assembly acted under the pressure of grief, anger, and a sense of religious duty. Experienced commanders were lost, not by the enemy, but by their own city. In a war in which Athens needed every capable leadership, this was devastating. Sparta, on the other hand, was able to concentrate its forces under Lysander. The war was approaching a decision, because Sparta now possessed exactly what it had previously lacked: serious naval power. It was not Sparta that had completely turned into an Athens, but it had learned enough to challenge Athens' greatest strength. The old juxtaposition of Spartan land power and Athenian naval power began to dissolve. Sparta could now exert pressure on both levels. For Athens, the situation was getting tighter and tighter. The city had shown incredible resilience. After the plague, internal crisis, Sicily and alliance uprisings, it was still at war. But resilience is not infinite. Resources became scarcer, allies more insecure, political decisions tougher, and military mistakes more consequential. Athens continued to fight, but it increasingly fought from a position of exhaustion. Sparta's counterattack was therefore not a single blow, but a slow change in the entire war. Persian money, Ionian uprisings, Spartan fleets, Athenian internal crises, and the rise of Lysander combined to form a new situation. Athens was not immediately destroyed. It has been robbed of its advantages step by step. The city, which had once dominated the sea, now had to fight for every sea connection. The city, which had once controlled allies, now had to fear their defection. The city that had once seen Sparta as an immovable land power now faced an adversary who had learned to turn its own weapon against it. This is how the last phase of the war was prepared. Athens had not yet fallen, but the danger was greater than ever. Sparta had understood that Athens' heart was not in the fields of Attica, but in the ships, in the ports, and on the sea routes. And that's exactly where the decisive blow would come. Chapter 14: The Fall of Athens. At the end of the Peloponnesian War, Athens was still standing, but the city was exhausted. It had survived the plague, devastation, political upheavals, the loss of the Sicily Expedition, and numerous uprisings. Again and again she had built new ships, mobilized new men, and drawn new hope. But every crisis had left its mark. Athens was no longer the unshakable naval power it had once been. His forces were thinned out, his allies insecure, his coffers strained, and his political leadership nervous. Sparta, on the other hand, had learned. At the beginning of the war, Sparta had been primarily a land power. His strength lay in the hoplites, in discipline, and in control of the Peloponnese. But against Athens, this strength alone was not enough. As long as Athens dominated the sea, it could supply itself, keep its empire together, and continue the war. Therefore, Sparta had to shift the war to the sea. With Persian support, especially money, Sparta was able to build up a strong fleet. The decisive man in this last phase was Lysander. Lysander was not only a general. He was a strategist, diplomat, and power politician. He understood that Athens did not necessarily have to be defeated by an assault on its walls. The city had to be cut off from its lifelines. Athens was dependent on the sea. Grain, especially from the Black Sea region, was crucial for the supply of the city. If this route were interrupted, the walls of Athens could be made of stone as strong as they wanted, but the people behind them would still starve. The decision approached the Hellespont, the strait through which important grain shipments reached Athens. There, the Athenian and Spartan fleets faced each other. The Athenians knew how important this region was. They had to prevent Sparta from gaining control of the sea routes. But the Athenian leadership was no longer as strong and united as it used to be. There was a lack of discipline, trust, and perhaps also the strategic clarity that had distinguished Athens in its best times. At Aegospotami, disaster finally occurred. The Athenian fleet was in an inconvenient location, not far from the Spartan fleet under Lysander. For several days, the Athenians offered a battle, but Lysander did not accept it immediately. He observed. He looked for the moment when the opponents became careless. And exactly this moment came. When many Athenian sailors had gone ashore to look for food or rest, Lysander suddenly attacked. The Athenians were taken by surprise. Their ships were not manned in time, their order collapsed, and the fleet was almost completely captured or destroyed. It was not a great heroic naval battle in which both sides fought long and in an orderly manner. It was a breakdown. Within a short time, Athens lost the core of its naval power. The consequences were devastating. Without a fleet, Athens could not protect its grain routes. Without a fleet, it could hardly hold on to its last allies. Without a fleet, the port of Piraeus was no longer the safe gateway to the world, but a vulnerable point. The loss at Aegospotami was basically the death sentence for Athens' ability to war. The city had survived many defeats, but this one was different. She hit the very heart of her power. Lysander now acted decisively. He sailed through the Aegean, put Athenian spheres of influence under pressure, and forced cities to secede from Athens. Athenian garrisons were expelled. Democratic orders were often replaced by oligarchic governments that were friendly to Sparta. The Athenian Empire, which had been built up over decades, fell apart in a short time. What had once begun as the Attic League and later became a sphere of influence for Athens now fell apart. Eventually, Athens itself was encircled. Sparta besieged the city by land, while the Spartan fleet blockaded the port. Now the bitter reversal of Pericles' old strategy became apparent. At the beginning of the war, the walls had protected Athens because the fleet could secure supplies by sea. Now the walls were still there, but the sea was lost. The city was no longer a fortress with a lifeline, but an enclosed mass of people. The hunger began. At first, the Athenians may have hoped for a turnaround, for help, for negotiations, or for a mistake by the opponent. But the situation became more and more hopeless. Supplies became scarce, prices rose, fear grew. A city can remain proud for a long time, but hunger is a relentless opponent. It undermines morality, politics, and resilience. The people who had once voted on expeditions, alliances, and grand plans now had to fear for their daily survival. In this situation, the memory of Athens' former greatness became particularly painful. This city had fought the Persians, ruled the Aegean Sea, built the Parthenon, produced poets and thinkers, and saw itself as the school of Greece. Now their citizens were faced with the question of whether they had to capitulate. For many, this was almost unbearable. Athens was not just any city. Athens was a symbol of democracy, naval power, culture, and ambition. His fall meant more than a military defeat. Athens' opponents discussed what should happen to the city. Some of Sparta's allies, especially those who had long suffered under Athens' power, wanted harsh punishments. There were voices calling for the destruction of Athens, the enslavement of the population, and the eradication of the city from the political map. From their point of view, Athens had oppressed other cities for too long, forced tributes, crushed uprisings, and ruthlessly used its power. Now it was to pay for it. Sparta, however, decided against the complete destruction of Athens. This was not done out of sheer leniency. Political considerations also played a role. Athens had played a significant role for Greece in the Persian Wars, and complete annihilation might have altered the balance too much. In addition, Sparta wanted to control Athens, not necessarily wipe it out. A weakened, dependent city could be useful. A burned ruin brought less political benefit. Nevertheless, the peace conditions were hard. Athens had to hand over its fleet except for a few ships. It had to give up its foreign possessions and submit to Sparta's leadership. Above all, however, the long walls had to be torn down, as well as the fortifications of the Piraeus. These walls had been the symbol of Athenian security for decades. They had connected the city and the port, defied land power and hunger, and made Athens' special strategy possible. Its demolition was a political and psychological spectacle. The walls were torn down to music. For the victors, it was a celebration, perhaps even the beginning of Greece's freedom from Athenian rule. For the Athenians, it was a humiliation. Every stone that fell was a reminder of lost power. The connection between Athens and the sea was symbolically severed. The city, which had drawn its strength from the port and the fleet, was forced to give up precisely this foundation. But the fall of Athens did not only end in military defeat. The city was also politically redesigned. Under Spartan influence, the rule of the so-called 30 tyrants came to power, an oligarchic government that cracked down on opponents with harshness. For Athens, which had been so proud of its democracy, this was another deep cut. The city not only lost its external power, but also temporarily lost its political identity. The 30 tyrants ruled with violence, persecution, and fear. Many citizens have been disenfranchised, expelled, or killed. Property was confiscated. Political opponents were eliminated. This shows that defeat in war often does not end with capitulation. It penetrates society, changes power relations, and opens the door for settling scores. Sparta's external victory became a time of oppression in the interior of Athens. And yet even that was not the final end of Athens. Democracy was to return later. The city should continue to play an important cultural and spiritual role. Philosophers, orators, and schools would continue to shape Athens after the war. But the Athens of the great maritime empire, the Athens of imperial self-confidence, the Athens that believed it could shape the Greek world according to its will, had fallen. The fall of Athens was therefore more than a military defeat. It was the end of an era. He showed that even a shiny city can break down due to overstretching, wrong decisions, internal conflicts, and the adaptability of its opponents. Athens had not been defeated because it would have been weak. It was defeated even though it was strong. Or perhaps precisely because his strength had seduced him to take ever greater risks. Sparta had won in the end, but this victory was dearly bought. Greece was exhausted. Many cities were devastated, many people dead, many political orders damaged. The Peloponnesian War had not produced a simple liberator. He had left behind a world in which mistrust, revenge, and power struggles lived on. When the long walls fell, the enemies of Athens rejoiced. For them, the war was over. But in truth, only one chapter was over. The rivalry between the Greek cities was not healed. The forces that had caused the war, fear, ambition, alliance pressure, and the desire for power, did not disappear with Athens' surrender. Athens had fallen. But Greece had not won. Chapter 15, Epilogue, The Price of War. When Athens capitulated and the long walls were torn down, the Peloponnesian War seemed to be decided. Sparta had won, Athens had lost, and many Greeks perhaps believed that a new era was now beginning. A time without Athenian supremacy, without the crushing tributes of the Sea League, without the fear of the fleet that had ruled the Aegean Sea for decades. For Sparta's allies, the moment must have seemed like a liberation. The mighty city that had ruled others for so long was defeated. But the victory did not bring real peace. The Peloponnesian War had not cleansed, united, and stabilized Greece. He had exhausted the Greek world. For many years, cities had fought against each other, fields had been devastated, fleets destroyed, alliances broken, and entire populations expelled or killed. The war had not only devoured soldiers, but also trust. And trust is harder to rebuild than walls. Athens was severely weakened in the end. His fleet was lost, his empire crumbled, his democracy temporarily overthrown. The reign of the 30 tyrants showed how deep the defeat penetrated into the interior of the city. Citizens were persecuted, opponents eliminated, property confiscated. The city, which had once prided itself on its freedom and political participation, experienced fear and oppression. Although democracy later returned, ancient Athens was no longer the same. The imperial power was broken. But Sparta was not a shining winner either. It had won the war, but now it was faced with a task for which it was hardly suitable. It had to lead Greece. Sparta was strong in discipline, land warfare, and conservative order. But supremacy over many different cities required diplomacy, flexibility, money, naval power, and political adaptability. It was precisely in this that Sparta was weaker. While Athens had held its empire together through fleet, tribute, and administration, Sparta now tried to impose its own order. In many cities, it supported oligarchic governments, i.e. rulers of a few men who were friendly to Sparta. But this did not lead to general freedom, but often only to a change of dependency. Many Greeks who had hoped to be liberated by Athens soon realized that Sparta was also engaged in power politics. This revealed a bitter truth. The Peloponnesian War had not simply been a struggle between oppression and freedom. Both sides had spoken of freedom if it benefited them. Both sides had controlled allies, punished opponents, and put their own interests above general justice. Athens had celebrated its democracy at home, while it often appeared imperious externally. Sparta had presented itself as a liberator, but also established influence and control after its victory. The war had changed the moral language of politics. Terms such as justice, security, loyalty to the alliance, and freedom were used again and again, but were often overshadowed by power interests. Cities claimed to only defend themselves while threatening others. Alliance leaders spoke of protecting their partners, but demanded obedience. Those who were strong called their strength order. Those who were weak called their resistance freedom. In this world, truth increasingly became a question of perspective. It is particularly shocking that the war was waged between Greeks. The cities shared language, gods, festivals, myths, and memories. They had once fought together against Persia. But these commonalities were not enough to prevent the power struggle. On the contrary, it was precisely because the cities were so close to each other that their rivalries became all the more bitter. It was not foreign worlds fighting against each other, but neighbors, trading partners, former allies, and culturally related communities. The consequences of this internal Greek war were long-term. Many city-states were financially weakened. Populations had suffered losses. Agricultural areas were damaged. Political orders were destabilized. In many cities, democratic and oligarchic groups had fought each other, often with the help of Athens or Sparta. The war thus left behind not only external destruction, but also internal divisions. After the war, the Greek world remained restless. Sparta's supremacy itself was soon called into question. Other cities did not want to subordinate themselves permanently. Thebes later gained in importance, Athens partially recovered, and new alliances were formed. Power changed, but the basic problems remained: mistrust, competition, changing alliances, and the inability to create a lasting common order. This is precisely where the greater tragedy lies. The Peloponnesian War decided the conflict between Athens and Sparta, but it did not solve the problem of Greek fragmentation. No city was strong enough to unite Greece in a fair and stable way in the long term. But every major power was strong enough to threaten the others. This created a cycle of advancement, fear, alliance building, war, and another change of power. This cycle weakened Greece so much that a new power was later able to rise: Macedonia. Under Philip II and later Alexander the Great, Macedonia was to dominate the Greek city-states. Of course, the Peloponnesian War was not the only reason for this, but he contributed to the fact that the classic polis used up their strength. As they fought each other, the possibility of external or semi-external supremacy became more likely. The war therefore shows us more than just ancient history. It shows a pattern that can be found again and again in history. A power rises. Another fears this promotion. Alliances are formed. Small conflicts become big tests. Politicians speak of security, honor, and necessity. In the end, each side believes that it has no choice. And when the war is over, it turns out that even the victor has paid a high price. Athens lost its empire, but Sparta lost the chance for real peace. Greece lost strength overall. The cultural flowering of Athens remained unforgotten, and even after the war, great ideas, philosophical schools, and political debates emerged. But the belief in the unbroken greatness of the city-states was shaken. The war had shown how destructive their rivalry could be. When we look at the Peloponnesian War today, we do not only see campaigns, battles, and famous men. We see Pericles, who designed a long-term strategy but could not foresee the plague. We see Alcibiades, whose talent and ambition fascinated cities and plunged them into chaos. We see Nicias, who warned and yet was led into the catastrophe. We see Lysander, who led Sparta to victory, but did not create a stable peace order. And we see countless nameless people who paid the price for decisions made by others. Farmers lost their fields. Rowers died at sea. Soldiers fell far from home. Families waited in vain for returnees. Cities were besieged, plundered, or politically overthrown. Behind the great concepts of history, there are always people who experience hunger, fear, grief, and loss. The Peloponnesian War was not just a conflict of strategies, but a human tragedy. Perhaps this is precisely the most important lesson of this war. Power can create security, but it can also create fear. Fear can justify defense, but it can also prepare for attack. Ambition can produce greatness, but also overstretching. And a victory can become worthless if it leaves behind a world too exhausted to sustain peace. Athens and Sparta fought for supremacy in Greece. In the end, Sparta won the war, but not the future. Athens lost its power, but not its significance for history. Greece lost its stability, but left the world with a warning that remains understandable to this day. Because the Peloponnesian War began with mistrust and ended with exhaustion. It began with the question of who should lead Greece and ended with a Greece that could hardly be led. It began as a power struggle between two cities and became a conflict that changed an entire world. So in the end, there is no easy triumph, no clear heroic story, and no clean conclusion. The realization remains that wars are often started by people who believe they can control them. But once they are unleashed, they change everything: the victors, the vanquished, and the world they have been led around. The Peloponnesian War was over, but his shadow remained.